There is a difference between fighting from the shadows and being of the shadows. The distinction matters. The galaxy is full of warriors who use darkness as a tool, who conceal themselves, who strike without warning, who exploit the gap between what the enemy sees and what is actually there. These warriors are effective, some of them are terrifying, but the darkness they use is instrumental. It is a weapon they pick up and set down, a condition they exploit rather than inhabit, a tactical advantage rather than a way of life. The Raven Guard do not use darkness. They live in it. Not metaphorically, not in the grimdark posturing that the 41st millennium encourages in warriors who want to seem more dangerous than they are. The Raven Guard inhabit the dark. Their Primarch was born in it, beneath the surface of a lightless moon, raised among prisoners who never saw the sky. Their legion was forged in the shadow of an empire's exploitation and tempered in the massacre that should have ended them. Their doctrine is built around the proposition that the unseen warrior is the effective warrior. And the effective warrior is the one who does not need the light. They are pale. This is not cosmetic, it is biological, the expression of their gene seed in the warriors who carry it. The Raven Guard's skin fades over time, the melanochromic organ that regulates skin color malfunctioning across the decades of service until the warrior's flesh is the color of something that has never known the sun. Their eyes darken correspondingly, becoming pools of black that reflect nothing. Their hair goes dark. They look, after long enough, like something that was born underground and has never left. In a galaxy of warriors who announce their presence through the thunder of their armor and the brightness of their heraldry, the Raven Guard wear black and disappear. This is their gift and their burden. The gift is obvious, a chapter that fights from concealment, that strikes before the enemy knows it is under attack, that can dismantle a defensive position from the inside before the defenders understand that something has gone wrong. The burden is less obvious but equally real. To live in the dark means to live with the things that the dark contains. The grief, the guilt, the specific weight of a chapter whose history is defined not by the victories it won, but by the catastrophe that should have destroyed it, and the desperate, terrible things it did in the attempt to survive. The Raven Guard's story is not a triumphant one. It is a story of survival under conditions that should have been fatal, of compromises made in the dark that the light could not have borne, of a Primarch who broke himself trying to save what remained of his sons, and who walked into the eye of terror carrying a guilt that 10,000 years of war had not been able to wash away. It is the darkest story in the Adeptus Astartes that does not involve the worship of chaos. And it begins, as all the darkest stories do, underground. Lycaeus was a prison, not a prison in the individual sense. Not a building with walls and guards and a population measured in hundreds. A prison in the industrial sense. An entire moon orbiting the forge world of Kievar, whose sole function was to provide the manufactoria below with the minerals they needed to keep producing, extracted by a labor force that had been sent there to die. The workers of Lycaeus were criminals, political dissidents, and anyone else that Kievar's ruling tech guilds found inconvenient. To be shipped to Lycaeus was a sentence in both senses of the word, a punishment and a declaration that your life, as a thing with value and future, was over. The miners worked until they died. They breathed air that was recycled too many times by machinery that was maintained too infrequently. They ate what the supply shuttles from Kievar brought, which was enough to sustain labor and not enough to sustain health. They lived in the tunnels they had dug, in the dark, under the watch of armed guards whose authority came from the tech guilds and whose sympathy for their charges was not a factor in their employment. Into this, a child fell from the sky. The Primarchs were scattered as infants, torn from the Emperor's laboratory by the powers of chaos, and deposited across the galaxy on worlds that would shape them into what they would become. Each Primarch's world was a mirror of the being the Primarch would grow into. Leman Russ landed on the Ice World and became the Wolf King. Sanguinius landed in the radioactive wastes and became the Angel. Vulcan landed on the volcanic Death World and became the Smith. Corvus Corax landed in a prison and became the Deliverer. He was found deep beneath the surface of Lycaeus, in a lightless chamber far below the mining tunnels, beneath a glacier that should have sealed him from discovery. The miners who found him, criminals, dissidents, the condemned, recognized something extraordinary in the child, not because they understood what a Primarch was, because they understood what hope looked like, and the child in the dark looked like hope. They hid him from the guards. They named him Corax, the Deliverer, in the tongue of the prisoners, a name that carried the weight of their expectation, and they raised him in the dark among the condemned. And the dark and the condemnation shaped everything he would become. Corax grew at the speed Primarchs grow, and as he grew he absorbed the world around him with the voracity of a mind designed by the Emperor to process everything it encountered. He learned the rhythms of the prison. He learned the guards' routines, the shift changes, the weaknesses in the surveillance that the tech guild's indifference had allowed to develop. He learned the skills that the prisoners could teach him, the skills of the underworld, of sabotage and subversion, and the kind of patient, methodical resistance that people who cannot fight openly develop when open fighting would mean immediate destruction. He learned to hide, not in the clumsy way that fugitives hide, not by finding a hole and sitting in it and hoping the searchers pass by. In the preternatural way that would later become his defining gift, the quality that made him unique among the Primarchs. Corvus Corax could make himself invisible. Not through technology, not through any external mechanism. Through will, through some quality of his psychic nature that allowed him to slip from the perception of those around him, to exist in the gap between seeing and noticing, to be present in a room and absent from the awareness of everyone in it. The prisoners called this quality shadow walking. The Imperium would later call it something else, and the Raven Guard's librarians would attempt to classify it in the frameworks that the Adeptus Astartes used to understand psychic phenomena. But the essence of it was simple and it was terrifying. Corvus Corax could be standing in front of you and you would not see him. He decided, very young, that the prison would end. Not his imprisonment, the imprisonment of everyone. Every miner on Lycaeus. Every condemned worker in the tunnels, every man and woman and child who had been sent to the lightless moon to extract minerals for masters who regarded them as equipment rather than people. Corax did not plan an escape. He planned a revolution. And the revolution, when it came, was the first expression of everything the Raven Guard would later become. Corax did not rush the revolution. This is the first thing that separated him from the Primarch he is most often compared to. Angron, the Red Angel, who landed on a slave world and fought his slavers immediately, directly, with the fury that would define him and his legion forever. Angron charged the chains. Corax studied them. For years, Corax organized. He trained the prisoners, not in the art of open combat, which would have been suicidal given the Tech Guild's military superiority, but in the arts he had learned in the tunnels. Sabotage, subversion, the systematic degradation of the infrastructure that the guards depended on while maintaining the appearance that everything was functioning normally. He identified the prisoners who could lead and gave them squads. He stockpiled weapons, not the weapons of armies, but the weapons of miners. The tools and explosives that the mining operation provided, and that could be repurposed by people with sufficient motivation. He waited, and he watched. And when the moment arrived, when the stockpile was sufficient, when the organization was complete, when the guards' routines had been mapped so thoroughly that their own responses had been incorporated into the plan, Corax launched the revolution with the precision of a surgical strike rather than the chaos of an uprising. The guards were overwhelmed, not by numbers, the prisoners outnumbered them. But the guards had weapons and armor and training and communications with Kievar below. The guards were overwhelmed because Corax had eliminated their advantages before the fighting started. Communications were cut. Supply lines were severed. The guard posts that should have been manned were empty, because the sabotage had redirected the guards to deal with fabricated emergencies elsewhere. By the time the guards understood that they were facing a coordinated revolution rather than a localized riot, the revolution had already won the tunnels. Lycaeus was free. The prisoners, miners, criminals, dissidents, the forgotten and the condemned stood in the tunnels they had been slaves in and understood that the chains were broken. Then Kievar struck back. The tech guilds were not prepared to accept the loss of their mineral supply. They had armies, technology, resources that dwarfed anything the freed prisoners possessed. They sent forces to reclaim Lycaeus, and the forces were substantial, enough to crush the revolution through sheer weight of conventional military power. Corax had anticipated this. He had planned for it in the same way he had planned for everything, by identifying the enemy's vulnerabilities before the enemy arrived, and building the response around the exploitation of those vulnerabilities. He outmaneuvered the Tech Guild's forces on Lycaeus' surface, using the terrain and the tunnels that his people knew intimately against soldiers who were fighting in an environment they had never bothered to understand. He ambushed. He retreated. He attacked from directions the enemy was not covering and vanished before the enemy could respond. And then, he did something terrible. The mining operations on Lycaeus used atomic charges to break open mineral seams that conventional explosives could not reach. Corax had been stockpiling these. He loaded 5 of them onto the small transport shuttles that ran between Lycaeus and Kievar, and he sent them down the supply gravity wells that connected the moon to the planet below. 5 atomic charges. 5 cities on Kievar, the 5 largest centers of the Tech Guild's power, struck simultaneously with weapons that were not conventional munitions but nuclear devices, detonated in the hearts of population centers that contained millions of people. Thousands died. The Tech Guild's industrial infrastructure was shattered. Their military capacity collapsed. Their ability to project power up to Lycaeus, the ability that made the reconquest possible, was destroyed in 5 simultaneous flashes of nuclear fire. Corax had freed his people by bombing a planet. This deserves to be sat with rather than passed over. The Primarch who would become the champion of guerrilla warfare, the Lord of Shadows, the Deliverer. He achieved the liberation of Lycaeus through nuclear terrorism. The attack targeted military-industrial infrastructure, but the infrastructure was in cities, and the cities contained civilians. And the civilians died in the thousands because the liberation required their deaths. Corax carried this. He carried it the way he carried everything. In the dark, without display, with the awareness of a leader who understood that the choice he had made was the right one, and that the right choice had killed people who did not deserve to die. The whip he carried into battle for the rest of his life, Talionis, a powered, twin-headed bullwhip, was not a weapon of convenience. It was a reminder, a symbol of the cruelty that had been inflicted on the people of Lycaeus, and that Corax had responded to with a cruelty of his own, different in kind but not in the fundamental fact of inflicted suffering. The freed prisoners renamed their moon. Lycaeus, the prison, the mine, the place of condemnation became deliverance, and on the day of the renaming, the Emperor arrived. The meeting between father and son was private. What passed between the Emperor of Mankind and the Primarch who had freed a world through revolution and nuclear fire is not recorded in the histories. They spoke for a day and a night alone, and what they discussed is known only to the two participants, one of whom sits on the golden throne in eternal silence, and the other of whom vanished into the Eye of Terror 10,000 years ago. What is recorded is the outcome. Corax was given command of the 6th Legion, the miners who had followed him, the warriors he had trained in the tunnels, the revolutionaries who had broken the chains of Lycaeus. The best of them were absorbed into the Legion, transformed into space marines, the gene seed of their Primarch implanted into the bodies of men who had been slaves and who would become warriors. The Raven Guard was born from a prison, born from a revolution, born from the dark, carrying the dark with them, wearing it on their armor and in their gene seed and in the doctrine that their Primarch would build for them, from the lessons he had learned beneath the surface of a moon that had tried to kill everyone on it. They went out into the galaxy, and the galaxy learned what a force built in the dark could do. The 6th Legion that Corax inherited was not what he wanted it to be. Before a Primarch found his Legion, the Legion operated under the command of officers appointed from the original Terran cadre, warriors created from the Primarch's gene seed, but raised on Terra, shaped by Terran military culture rather than the culture the Primarch would eventually bring. The 6th Legion's Terran contingent fought in a manner that Corax found deeply uncomfortable. They were effective. They were also brutal, practitioners of a form of warfare that used terror as a tool, that inflicted suffering as a means of breaking enemy morale, that treated the populations of conquered worlds as obstacles to be crushed, rather than people to be liberated. Corax looked at his Legion's methods and saw the tech guilds. He saw the same indifference to suffering, the same willingness to use people as instruments, the same fundamental assumption that the population being fought over was less important than the objective being fought for. Everything the Primarch had risen against on Lycaeus, the exploitation, the cruelty, the treatment of human beings as resources, was present in the tactics his own Legion employed. He changed it. Not gently, not gradually, not through the kind of institutional reform that Guilliman might have preferred. Corax purged. The officers who were most committed to the terror warfare approach, the ones who could not or would not adapt to the Primarch's philosophy, were reassigned to missions that would, quietly, not see them return. The Terran contingent's influence was diluted by the influx of warriors from Deliverance, fighters who carried Corax's values because they had been formed by the same experiences that had formed him. This was not kind. Some of the warriors Corax removed had served the Legion loyally for decades. They had fought the Great Crusade with the tools they had been given and the doctrine they had been trained in. And the arrival of a Primarch who replaced their doctrine with something they did not recognize felt, to some of them, like a betrayal. Corax understood their perspective. He replaced them anyway, because the alternative was to lead a legion that fought the way the tech guilds had fought, and that was something the Deliverer could not do. What emerged from the Purge was something new. The Raven Guard under Corax became a legion of liberation rather than conquest, or rather a legion that understood conquest as liberation, that approached the compliance of new worlds not as the subjugation of populations but as the freeing of them. The difference in approach produced different outcomes. Worlds brought into compliance by the Raven Guard tended to be more stable than those conquered by legions with more forceful methods, because the populations had been given a reason to cooperate rather than simply a reason to fear. The doctrine that Corax developed for his legion was the doctrine of Lycaeus writ large. Strike from concealment. Move through the gaps in the enemy's awareness. Target the infrastructure that holds the opposition together rather than the military force that the infrastructure supports. Win the fight before the enemy understands there is a fight. Speed, stealth, and precision. These became the Raven Guard's defining qualities, and they were expressed through a tactical framework that was different from anything else in the Adeptus Astartes. Where the Imperial fists built fortifications, the Raven Guard infiltrated them. Where the World Eaters charged, the Raven Guard maneuvered. Where the Iron Hands deployed heavy armor, the Raven Guard deployed warriors on foot. In small groups, in positions the enemy did not know were occupied. The Legion was paired with Horus during the Crusade, the War Master's force and the Shadow Fighters operating in the same campaigns, and the pairing produced friction. Horus fought wars through overwhelming force and charismatic domination. Corax fought wars through patience and precision. The two approaches were not complementary in the straightforward way that some Legion pairings were, and the philosophical gap between the War Master's preference for crushing displays of power and the Raven Lord's preference for invisible efficiency created tensions that never fully resolved. Corax did not particularly like Horus. This is not always stated in the histories, which tend to smooth the relationships between Primarchs into the categories of alliance and opposition. The relationship between Corax and the future War Master was more nuanced, a combination of professional respect for Horus's capability and personal discomfort with his methods and his appetite for glory. Corax did not seek glory. Glory drew attention, and attention was the enemy of everything the Raven Guard did well. The Raven Guard fought the Great Crusade as the force that arrived before the main assault, that dismantled the enemy's defenses from the inside before the other legions arrived to claim the visible victory. They were the shadow behind the light, the preparation that made the triumph possible, and they were comfortable with this role because Corax had built them to be comfortable with it. 80,000 warriors. That was the Legion's strength at its peak, not the largest force in the Adeptus Astartes, but a formidable one, and one whose effectiveness per warrior exceeded what raw numbers suggested. The Raven Guard punched above their weight, because the quality of their operations made each warrior's contribution disproportionate to the effort a comparable force would require. 80,000 warriors. It is worth remembering that number, because what happened next would reduce it to less than a fraction. Istvan Fee is the wound that the Raven Guard have carried for 10,000 years, and the wound has never healed. The Horus Heresy had begun. The War Master, Horus, whom the Emperor had elevated above all his other sons, whom the galaxy had celebrated as the greatest commander the Crusade had produced, had turned. 4 legions had declared for the traitor, the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, the World Eaters. They had gathered on the Istvan system, and the Emperor, through Rogel Dawn, had dispatched 7 legions to end the rebellion before it could spread. The plan was a hammer blow. 7 loyal legions against 4 traitors, overwhelming force applied at the point of the rebellion's concentration. The first wave, 3 legions, would make planetfall and engage the traitors directly. The second wave, 4 legions, would deploy afterward, catching the traitors between 2 forces and crushing them. The Raven Guard were in the first wave, alongside the Iron Hands and the Salamanders. Corax led his legion into the assault with the precision that defined everything the Raven Guard did. Drop pods and stormbirds descended through the atmosphere of Istvan V's black sand surface, and the 3 legions struck the traitor positions with coordinated fury. The fighting was intense. The traitors had prepared their defenses, and the assault was costly. But the first wave was succeeding. The traitor positions were buckling under the combined pressure. And then the second wave arrived. The 4 legions that were supposed to be the anvil against which the first wave's hammer would crush the traitors. The Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word Bearers, the Alpha Legion. They deployed. They took up their positions, and they opened fire on the loyalists. The second wave was not loyal. 4 legions that the Emperor had believed were his had been turned by Horus, and they had been positioned in the second wave precisely for this moment. The moment when the first wave was fully committed, fully engaged, fully exposed, and the arrival of reinforcements from behind would not be reinforcement but annihilation. The first wave was trapped. 3 legions caught between the traitor positions they had been assaulting and the 4 legions that had just revealed themselves as traitors. 7 traitor legions against 3 loyalist ones, in conditions that had been designed from the beginning to produce a massacre. It was a massacre. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands charged the enemy. He drove forward into the heart of the traitor lines, seeking Fulgrim, his brother, the Primarch of the Emperor's children, the friend who had betrayed him. Ferrus Manus found Fulgrim, and Fulgrim killed him. Cut his head from his shoulders. The Primarch of the Iron Hands beheaded on the black sands of Istvan V. Vulcan of the Salamanders was overwhelmed. His legion fought with the stubborn fury that defined them, but the numbers were impossible and the Salamanders were ground down. Vulcan himself was believed killed, his body lost in the carnage, his fate unknown for centuries. Corax fought. He fought with his lightning claws and with Talionis, and with the shadow-walking gift that made him impossible to pin down. And in the chaos of the massacre he found an enemy worth killing. Lorgar, the Primarch of the Word Bearers, the legion whose treachery at Calth had helped make the heresy possible, the son who had turned to chaos because the Emperor had told him to stop worshipping. Corax found Lorgar on the Black Sands, and he attacked him with everything he had. He was winning. The Deliverer was killing the heretic, driving his lightning claws into Lorgar's flesh, impaling the word-bearer's Primarch with a fury that went past tactical engagement into something raw and personal. Lorgar was dying. The kill was moments away. And then Conrad Kurz appeared. The Night Haunter, the Primarch of the Night Lords, the dark mirror of everything Corax was, the Lord of Terror who used the same shadows for opposite purposes. Kurze intervened, attacking Corax from the side, forcing the Raven Lord to break off his killing blow and defend himself against a Primarch whose combat capability in close quarters was devastating. Corax retreated. This was not cowardice. It was survival. The same cold calculation that had kept him alive in the tunnels of Lycaeus. He could not fight two Primarchs simultaneously. Lorgar was wounded but not dead. Kurz was fresh and murderous. The mathematics of the engagement said retreat, and Corax obeyed the mathematics. Later, in the aftermath, Corax would realize something about his retreat from Kurze that haunted him more than the tactical failure. He had felt fear. Not the fear of death. A Primarch's relationship to death is not what an ordinary human's is. The fear of recognition. Corax looked at Kurze and saw what he might have become if his capsule had landed on Nostramo instead of Lycaeus. A Primarch shaped by darkness into something that used the darkness to terrorize rather than to liberate. The fear was not of Kurze, the fear was of the version of himself that Kurze represented. The Deliverer who had become the tyrant, the shadow that had consumed the light instead of concealing it. The massacre ground on. The Raven Guard, like the other First Wave legions, were being annihilated. The Black Sands of Istvan Fee drank the blood of warriors whose loyalty had been rewarded with treachery, and the dying went on, and the reinforcements that should have come were the enemy that was doing the killing. Corax survived. He gathered what remained of his legion, the shattered remnant, the warriors who had not been killed in the crossfire between 7 traitor legions. And he did what the Deliverer had always done in impossible situations. He disappeared into the dark, into the shadows of Istvan V's ruined terrain, into the crevasses and the tunnels and the broken ground that a force trained in guerrilla warfare could exploit even when every other advantage had been lost. Corax took his survivors underground, and he fought. For 98 days. 98 days of guerrilla war on the surface and beneath the surface of a world that had just witnessed the death of a legion and the beginning of the heresy's most devastating chapter. 98 days of scavenging supplies from fallen enemies, of operating in small bands, of striking the traitor positions and vanishing before the response could reach them. 98 days of the skills that Lycaeus had taught applied to the worst possible conditions, by warriors who were fighting not to win. Winning was not available, but to survive long enough for rescue to arrive. The rescue came. Captain Bran Neve, left as a reserve on Deliverance, brought a small fleet to Istvan Fee in response to visions that had troubled the Imperial army officer Marcus Valerius. The fleet broke through the traitor cordon, extracted the survivors, and carried what remained of the Raven Guard away from the world that had nearly killed them. What remained was less than 3,000 warriors from 80,000. The Raven Guard had entered the Istvan system as one of the Imperium's most effective fighting forces, and had left it as a remnant, a fragment, a chapter's worth of survivors from a legion that had numbered in the tens of thousands. The Drop Site Massacre had not destroyed the Raven Guard, but it had broken them in a way that the chapter has never fully recovered from, and the attempts to repair the breaking would produce a horror that was, in some ways, worse than the massacre itself. The 98 days deserve more attention than a single paragraph, because they are the Raven Guard's founding myth, not the liberation of Lycaeus, which belongs to the Legion, but the survival of Istvan the Fee, which belongs to the chapter. After the Drop Site Massacre's initial slaughter, Corax gathered what remained. The task was itself a nightmare, finding survivors in a killing ground that extended across a continent, in conditions where the traitor legions held the field and were actively hunting the loyalist remnants. The black sands of Istvan Fee were littered with the dead and the dying, and the distinction between the two was not always clear at a distance. Warriors who lay still might be dead. They might also be wounded, waiting for the traitor patrols to pass before crawling toward a rally point that might or might not still exist. Corax used the shadow walking. He moved through the carnage in the way that only he could, unseen, undetected, a Primarch-sized presence that the traitor legion patrols could not perceive even when they passed within meters of him. He found his sons. One by one, in twos and threes, in the broken ground and the crevasses and the impact craters that the battle had carved into the planet's surface. He guided them to the rally points he established in the most defensible terrain Istvan V's geography offered, and from these positions he organized the resistance. The resistance was Lycaeus again, different in scale, different in specifics, but the same in its fundamental nature, a small force, outnumbered catastrophically, fighting from concealment against an enemy that controlled the open ground, sustained by the skills that had been developed in conditions of imprisonment and that were now being applied to conditions of survival. The Raven Guard scavenged weapons from the fallen, both loyalist and traitor dead, because a bolter does not care who fired it last, and the Raven Guard were not in a position to be fastidious about the provenance of their ammunition. They operated in small groups, units of 5 to 10 warriors, too small to be detected by the sweeps the traitor forces were running, large enough to conduct the kind of harassing actions that made the traitor occupation of the field more expensive than it should have been. They ambushed supply convoys. They assassinated officers. They sabotaged equipment, disabled vehicles, contaminated water supplies. They did not and could not defeat the traitor forces. The numerical disparity was too vast, the enemy too powerful, the Raven Guard too diminished. But they could make the victory that the traitors had achieved at the Drop Site Massacre incomplete. They could deny the enemy the total control of the field that the massacre should have produced. They could demonstrate through 98 days of sustained guerrilla warfare on a hostile planet against 7 traitor legions that the Raven Guard were not finished. The traitors hunted them. The Night Lords in particular, Curz's legion, the masters of terror warfare, were employed to track and eliminate the loyalist survivors. It was a task that should have been straightforward: find the remnants, kill them, move on. The Night Lords found it considerably more difficult than anticipated, because the warriors they were hunting had been trained in concealment and evasion by a Primarch who could literally disappear from sight, and the Night Lord's preference for visible terror was less effective against an enemy that refused to be visible. Corax and Curze hunted each other through the ruins. The two Primarchs, the Deliverer and the Night Haunter, the Shadow Liberator and the Shadow Tyrant, played a game of concealment and pursuit across the broken landscape that neither could decisively win. Corax could not kill Curze without exposing himself to the traitor forces that surrounded the field. Curze could not find Corax without entering the kill zones that the Raven Lord had established in the terrain he had learned to read. The stalemate held for 98 days. It broke when Captain Bran Neve arrived from Deliverance with a strike force, a small fleet that punched through the traitor cordon long enough to extract the survivors from the surface. The extraction was chaotic, costly, conducted under fire from traitor forces who had understood too late that the remnant they had been trying to eliminate was escaping. But it worked. The survivors reached the ships. The ships broke orbit. The Raven Guard left Istvan V. They left carrying the dead alongside the living. The gene seed of fallen warriors recovered from the field, because the gene seed was the future of the Legion, and the future could not be left on the Black Sands for the traitors to claim. The recovery of the gene seed had been one of the guerrilla force's secondary objectives throughout the 98 days, conducted alongside the harassment operations, the warriors moving through the killing ground at night to reach the dead and extract the genetic inheritance that each fallen warrior carried. This is the detail that the dramatic accounts sometimes omit. The survival was not simply about staying alive. It was about preserving the capacity to rebuild. Every fallen Raven Guard whose gene seed was recovered was a fallen warrior whose genetic contribution to the Legion's future survived even when the warrior did not. The 98 days were not just a guerrilla campaign. They were a salvage operation, conducted in the most dangerous conditions imaginable, against the most powerful enemy the Imperium had ever faced. The Raven Guard emerged from Istvan V with fewer than 3,000 warriors and the gene seed of thousands more. The living and the dead carried together away from the killing ground, toward Deliverance, and the desperate attempt to rebuild that would produce the Raptor Project and everything that followed. The 98 days taught the Raven Guard what they are. Not a legion of the line, not a force designed for the massed engagement, the set-piece battle, the kind of warfare that the Drop Site Massacre had demonstrated could destroy them utterly. A force designed for the aftermath, for the ruins, for the conditions that exist when everything has gone wrong and the only question remaining is whether anything can be salvaged. The Raven Guard salvage, it is what they have done since Istvan V. It is what they will continue to do for as long as the galaxy produces conditions where salvage is the only option. Corax was desperate. This word does not apply to Primarchs easily. They were designed to be beyond desperation. Beings of such physical and mental capability that the emotional states that govern mortal decision-making were supposed to be either absent or manageable. But Corax was desperate, and the desperation drove him to do the thing that would haunt him more completely than the Drop Site Massacre itself. The Raven Guard was dying. 3,000 survivors from 80,000. The Legion that had been one of the Imperium's most effective fighting forces was now a remnant too small to prosecute a campaign, too damaged to rebuild through normal recruitment and gene seed implantation, and too important to abandon. The heresy was raging. The Imperium was tearing itself apart. The loyalist forces needed every warrior they could field, And the Raven Guard, one of the legions that had remained loyal, that had bled for that loyalty on the black sands of Istvan V, could not provide what the Imperium needed, because the Imperium's enemies had taken it from them. Corax went to Terra. He went to see the Emperor. The Emperor was occupied, consumed by the work on the Imperial Webway, the secret project that was supposed to provide humanity with a network of warp-free passages across the galaxy. The Webway demanded the Emperor's full psychic attention, and the Emperor was not, in the ordinary sense, available for consultation. But Corax's need was urgent enough, and his loyalty beyond question. And the Emperor, sensing his son's desperation through the psychic bond that connected the Primarchs to their father, found a way. He gave Corax something that no other Primarch had received: the original genetic template, the raw biological data from which the Primarchs themselves had been created, the master document of the gene craft that had produced the 20 superhuman sons of the Emperor. With this information, Corax could potentially bypass the slow, conventional process of gene seed cultivation and create new Raven Guard at a rate that would rebuild the Legion in weeks rather than decades. Corax returned to Deliverance with the template and handed it to his chief apothecary, Vincente VI. The work began immediately. Fresh recruits from Deliverance's population were selected, the modified gene seed was implanted, and the accelerated development process began. The results were initially extraordinary. The new warriors, called Raptors, a designation that would later carry very different connotations when applied to a successor chapter, matured faster than standard Astartes, reaching combat readiness in weeks rather than the years that ordinary implantation required. They were strong, fast, viable. The Raptor program looked like exactly what Corax needed. A way to rebuild the Raven Guard rapidly enough to return the Legion to fighting strength in time to matter. Then the mutations began. The first Raptors developed normally. The second generation showed irregularities, physical deformities, cognitive degradation, the biological expression of something going wrong in the gene craft, at a level that the apothecaries could not immediately identify. The third generation was worse, and the fourth was monstrous. Warriors whose bodies had been twisted by the accelerated process into things that were no longer recognizably human, whose minds had deteriorated to the point of animal intelligence, whose physical capabilities were impressive but whose capacity for the disciplined warfare that the Raven Guard required was gone. The Raptors were becoming creatures, not warriors, not space marines. Things that fought because the fighting instinct was the last instinct the deterioration had left intact, and that fought without the judgment or the discipline that distinguished a space marine from a biological weapon. The cause was discovered. Alpha Legion infiltrators. The Alpha Legion, the most insidious of the traitor legions, the force that fought through deception and infiltration rather than open battle, had planted operatives among the Raven Guard's survivors during the chaos of the Drop Site Massacre's aftermath. These operatives had embedded themselves in the Legion's structure with the kind of thoroughness that the Alpha Legion was renowned for, and they had waited for exactly this moment. When the Raptor program began, the infiltrators sabotaged the gene craft, introducing contaminants into the genetic template, corrupting the processes that the apothecaries were using, ensuring that the program that was supposed to save the Raven Guard would instead produce monsters. The Alpha Legion had let Corax escape from Istvan V. This is the cruelty that makes the revelation so devastating. The survival of the Raven Guard's remnant, The 98 days of guerrilla warfare, the rescue by Captain Bran, the escape that had seemed like a miracle, had been permitted. The Alpha Legion had allowed it because the plan was not to kill the Raven Guard on Istvan V, but to destroy them from the inside, through the very act of trying to rebuild. When the infiltration was discovered, the Alpha Legion operatives were purged. Every infiltrator that could be identified was found and killed, and the Raptor program was terminated immediately. But the damage was done. The genetic template had been corrupted, and the corruption had produced a population of mutated warriors, whose existence was a standing condemnation of the desperation that had created them. Corax looked at what the program had produced. He looked at the raptors, the twisted, deformed, cognitively degraded creatures that had been intended to be Raven Guard warriors, and that were instead the evidence of a failure so complete that it eclipsed the Drop Site Massacre in the toll it took on the Primarch's soul. And he made the decision. The raptors who could still fight were allowed to continue fighting. Their remaining lives would be spent in the service of the Imperium, in the battles that the Heresy produced, their mutated bodies thrown at the enemy in engagements where their enhanced physical capability still had value, even without the disciplined intelligence that a true space marine would bring. They would fight, and they would die, and their deaths would at least serve the cause that their creation had been intended to serve. But the rest, the raptors who could not fight, who had deteriorated beyond the capacity for even the most basic combat operations, were given the Emperor's peace by Corax. Personally, the Primarch killed his own sons. Not in battle, not in the fury of combat where a warrior's death carries the weight of sacrifice and honor. In the quiet, in the dark, one by one, the mutated warriors who had been created by the desperation of a Primarch who could not accept the death of his legion were killed by the hand that had created them, and each death was a prayer for mercy spoken by a being who did not know whether mercy was available. This broke Corax. Not immediately. The breaking would take years. Decades. The slow accumulation of guilt that the Heresy's demands did not allow him time to process. But the crack was there from the moment the last raptor died under his hand, and everything that followed was shaped by it. The Raven Guard did not take part in the Siege of Terror. Their numbers were too few. Their Primarch too damaged, their capacity for the kind of sustained major engagement that the siege required too diminished by everything that Istvan V and the Raptor project had taken from them. Instead, the Raven Guard fought elsewhere, coming to the aid of the Space Wolves at the Battle of Yarant, rescuing Leman Russ's legion from a trap that would have destroyed them. Even shattered, even diminished, even carrying the weight of everything the Heresy had done to them, the Raven Guard fought where they could, because fighting was what they were for and the war did not pause for grief. But the grief was there. And after the Heresy ended, the grief would consume the Deliverer completely. After the Heresy, Corax retreated. Not from the Imperium, he accepted the Second Founding, supported Guilliman's Codex Astartes, understood the necessity of breaking the legions into chapters. The Raven Guard was already small enough that the division was less traumatic for them than for legions that had maintained larger numbers. The remnant of 3,000 became the core of the Raven Guard chapter, and the few successor chapters that the diminished gene seed could support were founded and sent out into the galaxy. What Corax retreated from was himself. He returned to deliverance, to the Raven Spire, the fortress monastery that had been built from the former prison administration tower, the same structure that had overseen the slavery of Lycaeus transformed into the seat of the chapter that had been born from its ashes. And he locked himself in his chambers. For a year, the Raven Guard heard nothing from their Primarch. The door was sealed. Communications were refused. The chapter's officers managed the chapter's affairs without the Primarch's input, because the Primarch had chosen not to provide input. What they heard through the sealed door was a voice, a single word, repeated again and again in the dark, nevermore. The reference is deliberate, and it is ancient. 10,000 years before the Imperium, a poet on old Earth had written about a man haunted by a bird that spoke a single word. A word of finality, of loss, of the absolute certainty that what was lost could not be recovered. The poet's name was Edgar Allan Poe, and the bird was a raven, and the word was nevermore. Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, the Deliverer, the Lord of Shadow, locked in his chambers in the tower that bore his legion's name, speaking a word that carried the weight of everything he had done and failed to do. The sons he had led to slaughter at Istvan Fee, nevermore. The sons he had created in desperation, and that desperation had turned into monsters, nevermore. The sons he had killed with his own hands, one by one, in the quiet, granting them the mercy that the galaxy had not granted him, nevermore. What happened inside that chamber during the year of Corax's isolation is not recorded. Whether he received the absolution he was seeking, whether the Emperor from the Golden Throne reached out to the son who was drowning in guilt and gave him something that made the drowning stop, is not known. What is known is that after a year the door opened. Corax emerged. He was not the same as the Primarch who had entered the chamber. The histories describe a being who had made a decision, a final decision, and who had emerged from his isolation with the specific clarity of someone who knows exactly what he is going to do and is no longer in any doubt about it. He told his chapter what the decision was. He was leaving. He was going to the Eye of Terror, the great wound in reality where the traitor legions had fled after the heresy, the realm of chaos where the brothers who had betrayed the Imperium had taken refuge. He was going to hunt them, not to lead a crusade, not at the head of a fleet with warriors at his command and a campaign plan and the institutional support of the Raven Guard behind him. Alone, Corax was going into the Eye of Terror alone, to hunt the traitor Primarchs who had orchestrated the Drop Site Massacre, to find them in the realm they had claimed, and to make them answer for what they had done. His last words to his chapter were two: nevermore. He left Deliverance on a course toward the Eye of Terror. The Raven Guard watched their Primarch depart, carrying nothing but his weapons and his guilt, into the darkness that had consumed the brothers who had destroyed him. He has not returned. 10,000 years have passed, and Corvus Corax has not come back from the Eye. But the Raven Guard know he is still there. Reports have filtered out over the millennia. Fragments of intelligence from the Eye's margins, intercepted communications from traitor forces, the specific testimony of word-bearers captured by Imperial forces who describe being hunted through the Eye by something they could not see, something that moved through the darkness with the ease of something born in it, something that killed without warning, without sound, without the kind of presence that allowed the hunted to prepare for the hunter. The word-bearers called it a daemon. They were wrong, or they were right in a way they did not intend. Corvus Corax inside the Eye of Terror has been changed by the warp in the way that the warp changes everything it touches. His shadow-walking gift, the psychic ability to slip from perception, to exist in the gap between sight and awareness, has been amplified, twisted, transformed by the raw psychic energy of the eye into something that is no longer entirely the ability of a Primarch and not quite the power of a daemon. He is something in between, a shadow that hunts, a darkness that kills. In the short story Shadow of the Past, word-bearers operating in the Eye of Terror are stalked by something they initially believed to be a daemon. It is not. It is Corax, transformed, hunting the sons of the Legion whose Primarch he almost killed on Istvan Fee, continuing the war that the Drop Site Massacre started, pursuing vengeance through the realm of the enemy with a patience that transcends mortality. Whether Corax will return is one of the more debated questions in the Imperium's mythology. The galaxy has seen Primarch's return. Gilliman woke from stasis, the lion emerged from beneath the rock. Whether the thing that Corax has become in the Eye of Terror is capable of returning, whether the transformation the warp has worked on him permits the kind of physical presence in the material universe that a return would require, is a question that the available evidence does not answer. The Raven Guard do not speculate publicly. They maintain the Raven Spire. They uphold the traditions their Primarch established. They fight from the shadows with the doctrine Corax designed, and they carry the gene seed that he carried, and they wait. In the meantime, somewhere in the Eye of Terror, something that used to be a Primarch is still hunting. The word-bearers know this. They know because their brothers keep dying. The Drop Site Massacre is not simply a historical event for the Raven Guard. It is the defining trauma, the foundational wound around which the chapter's identity is constructed, the catastrophe that shaped everything the chapter has become in the 10,000 years since it happened. Every Raven Guard warrior knows the story of Istvan Fee, not in the abstract way that most Space Marines know the broad strokes of the heresy, as history, as background, as the ancient event that explains why the Imperium is what it is. The Raven Guard know Istvan Fifth in the specific, intimate, perpetually present way that a family knows its worst moment. The details are taught. The lessons are drawn. The names of the fallen are maintained in the chapter's records not as a list but as a memorial. And the memorial is not a ceremonial object maintained for institutional purposes. It is a wound that the chapter keeps open deliberately, because the wound is what teaches the lesson that the chapter cannot afford to forget. The lesson is this: trust kills. Not the ordinary trust between warriors in combat. The Raven Guard maintain that trust as completely as any chapter, and the bonds between brothers in arms are as strong in the Raven Guard as they are anywhere in the Adeptus Astartes. The trust that kills is the institutional trust, the assumption that the systems around you are functioning as designed, that the allies who stand beside you are what they appear to be, that the reinforcements that are supposed to arrive will arrive as friends rather than enemies. At Istvan Fee, 4 legions that the Imperium had trusted turned their guns on the warriors who trusted them. The system that was supposed to protect the Raven Guard was the system that destroyed them. The allies who were supposed to reinforce the first wave were the enemies who completed the first wave's annihilation. The trust was not naive. The Primarchs who led the first wave had no reason to suspect the second wave's treachery, because the treachery was unprecedented and the systems that should have prevented it had been compromised at levels the Primarchs could not have known about. But the Trust killed 80,000 warriors, and the Raven Guard who survived learned the lesson that the killing taught. They have never trusted a system that they have not verified. They have never accepted an ally at face value without conducting their own assessment of the ally's intentions and capabilities. They have never deployed into a situation without planning for the possibility that the situation is not what it appears to be, and that the allies they are counting on may not be allies when the moment arrives. This sounds like paranoia. It is not paranoia if the thing you are afraid of has already happened to you. The Raven Guard's caution is not the caution of the fearful. It is the caution of the informed. Warriors who know from the most direct possible experience what happens when the information you are operating from turns out to be wrong. The chapter plans for betrayal not because the chapter expects betrayal, but because the chapter knows what betrayal costs when you have not planned for it. This makes them difficult allies. Other chapters find the Raven Guard's reserve suspicious. The warrior who does not fully commit to the alliance, who maintains an independent intelligence picture alongside the shared one, who deploys his forces in a configuration that preserves his ability to disengage if the engagement is not what it appears to be. These behaviors look like distrust. And they are distrust. And the distrust is not personal but institutional. The Raven Guard do not distrust their allies as individuals. They distrust the conditions that produce allies, because the conditions have been demonstrated to produce enemies wearing the same face. The chapter processes this institutional trauma through the same mechanisms it processes everything, quietly, internally, through the culture rather than through formal ceremony. The Raven Guard do not hold annual commemorations of Istvan Fee the way some chapters mark their foundational moments. The chapter does not need a ceremony to remember the massacre, because the massacre is present in every tactical decision the chapter makes. The planning for betrayal is the commemoration. The reserve maintained in every alliance is the memorial. The chapter remembers Istvan V by being the chapter that Istvan V made. This is not healthy in the way that ordinary human psychology measures health. A human community that processed its foundational trauma by integrating the trauma into every subsequent institutional decision would be, in the clinical assessment, deeply damaged. The Raven Guard are deeply damaged. They know this. The damage is the chapter's inheritance from a day when 80,000 warriors trusted a system that murdered them. And the inheritance is not something the chapter can set down, because setting it down would mean trusting again. And trusting again is the thing the massacre taught them not to do. They carry it, the way they carry the damaged gene seed and the depleted numbers and the absent Primarch and everything else that Istvan Fee and its consequences have loaded onto the chapter's shoulders. They carry it, and they fight with it, and the carrying and the fighting are the same thing. Because the Raven Guard do not separate what they carry from what they do. 10,000 years have not healed it. 10,000 years cannot heal a wound that the chapter keeps open on purpose. The Raven Guard's doctrine is the doctrine of Lycaeus refined across 10,000 years of galactic war. It begins with a principle that other chapters acknowledge but do not build their identity around. The unseen strike is the decisive one. A warrior who has achieved surprise has already won. Everything that follows the surprise is the working out of an advantage that was established before the first shot was fired. The Raven Guard's entire tactical framework is oriented toward achieving this advantage. And everything in the framework, training, equipment, deployment, The culture that shapes how warriors think about the engagement serves the goal of being the force the enemy did not know was there until it was too late. This is not stealth for the sake of stealth. The Raven Guard are not assassins. They are not the Officio Assassinorum, whose operatives eliminate individual targets through concealment and withdrawal. The Raven Guard are Space Marines. They fight wars. They hold objectives. They prosecute campaigns that require the full spectrum of military capability, but they do all of this through the lens of concealment, approaching every engagement with the assumption that the warrior who is seen first is the warrior who dies first. The approach is built from the ground up. Raven Guard deployment begins long before the battle, with reconnaissance that is more thorough and more deeply embedded than what most chapters produce. The Raven Guard do not simply scout the enemy's positions. They infiltrate the enemy's territory, establishing observation points that may be maintained for days before the engagement begins. Building a picture of the enemy's strength, routine, and vulnerabilities that goes past what orbital surveillance and standard scouting can provide. The warriors who conduct this reconnaissance are not specialists in the narrow sense. Every Raven Guard warrior is trained in infiltration and concealment to a degree that would mark him as a specialist in most other chapters. The chapter does not maintain a separate scout company that handles the reconnaissance function and then hands off to the line companies for the assault. The entire chapter is, in a meaningful sense, a reconnaissance force. Warriors whose baseline capability includes the ability to move through hostile territory without being detected, to establish positions in the enemy's midst without being discovered, to remain there for extended periods and withdraw without alerting the enemy to the fact that they were ever present. When the assault comes, it comes from the positions the reconnaissance has established, not from the direction the enemy is watching, from the direction the enemy has discounted, from the angle that the enemy's defensive structure does not cover, because the enemy did not believe anyone could approach from that angle. The Raven Guard exploit blind spots. They find the gaps between overlapping fields of fire, the spaces between patrol routes, the dead ground that every defensive position contains, but that only a force with intimate knowledge of the position's layout can reach. The assault itself is fast, violent, and focused. The Raven Guard do not engage in grinding attritional combat when it can be avoided. They hit the critical node, the command center, the communications hub, the ammunition store, the generator that powers the defensive systems, and they hit it with overwhelming force at a single point, while the rest of the enemy's position is still processing the fact that it is under attack. The engagement is designed to be over before the enemy can bring its full strength to bear, to destroy the thing the enemy needs most rather than defeating the enemy's force in total. Lightning claws are the iconic weapon of the Raven Guard. The chapter's preference for paired lightning claws in close combat is more than an aesthetic choice. It reflects the doctrine's emphasis on the assault phase. Lightning claws are weapons of the rapid, decisive kill. They do not batter. They do not bludgeon. They cut. The warrior wielding them arrives in the enemy's position at speed, delivers the kills that the reconnaissance identified as necessary, and moves to the next target or withdraws before the enemy's reserve can respond. The Assault Marines are the Raven Guard's most celebrated tactical formation. Warriors in jump packs who descend from concealment at the critical moment. A rain of black armored killers falling from the sky into the heart of the enemy's position, with the combination of surprise and violence that the doctrine is designed to produce. The descent is the moment of revelation, the moment when the enemy, who did not know the Raven Guard were there, discovers that they are there in the most direct possible way. The revelation is brief. The killing follows immediately, and the killing is thorough. This approach has weaknesses. The Raven Guard do not excel at prolonged engagements. A battle that devolves into attrition favors forces with greater numbers, heavier equipment, and the willingness to sustain casualties over extended periods, qualities that the Raven Guard, shaped by the losses of Istvan V into a force that hoards every warrior, cannot match. When the surprise is lost, when the engagement extends past the decisive strike into a grinding contest of endurance, the Raven Guard are fighting on terms that do not favor them. They know this. The doctrine accounts for it. The withdrawal is planned alongside the assault, the extraction route identified before the insertion begins, the fallback positions established before the advance moves past them. A Raven Guard force that has lost the initiative does not stand and fight in the way the Imperial Fists or the Ultramarines might. It disengages, regroups and repositions for another strike from a different angle. The enemy that believes it has survived a Raven Guard attack has survived one phase of a Raven Guard attack. The next phase is already in preparation. The doctrine's demands on individual warrior judgment are high. A warrior operating deep in enemy territory, in a small team with limited communication and the constant risk of discovery, must be able to make correct tactical decisions without waiting for orders. The Raven Guard's culture supports this. The chapter produces warriors who are expected to think independently, to evaluate situations against the doctrine's principles rather than against specific instructions, and to act on their evaluation with the confidence that the chapter will support correct decisions even when those decisions were made without prior authorization. This is the legacy of Lycaeus. The prisoners who fought in the tunnels did not have a command structure that could direct their every action. They had principles and initiative, and the understanding that the warrior who was present at the moment of decision was the warrior who had to make the decision. Corax built this into the Raven Guard's DNA, and 10,000 years later it remains one of the chapter's defining qualities. The Raven Guard's equipment reflects both their doctrine and their history, and the history is a history of doing without. After Istvan V, the legion that rebuilt itself did so with resources that were a fraction of what a full-strength legion could command. Heavy vehicles were scarce. The land raiders and predators that other legions fielded in abundance were lost in the massacre, and the diminished legion's production capacity could not replace them at the rate the pre-Istvan force had maintained. Dreadnoughts were few. The walking tombs require a warrior to fall in just the right way, critically wounded but not killed, his body shattered but his mind intact, and the Raven Guard's losses at Istvan V had been too total and too swift for many warriors to be recovered in the specific condition that dreadnought internment requires. The chapter that emerged from this period of deprivation learnt to fight without the heavy equipment that other chapters considered standard. And the learning became doctrine, and the doctrine became identity. And the Raven Guard's relative scarcity of heavy armor is now not simply a logistical limitation but a philosophical choice. A force that emphasizes speed and concealment does not benefit from the presence of vehicles that are neither fast nor concealable. A land raider is the most formidable assault vehicle in the Astartes arsenal, but it is also the noisiest, the most visible, and the most difficult to conceal from an enemy who is looking for it. The Raven Guard prefer not to announce their presence through the rumble of a main battle tank. What they do use is lighter, faster, and more compatible with the chapter's approach. Jump packs are ubiquitous. The Raven Guard field a higher proportion of jump-capable warriors than almost any other chapter, because the jump pack provides the combination of mobility and flexibility that the doctrine demands. A warrior in a jump pack can cover ground quickly, approach from unexpected angles, strike from elevation, and withdraw at speed. The jump pack does what the Raven Guard's tactics require. It puts the warrior where the warrior needs to be, when the warrior needs to be there, without the logistical tail that ground-based transport requires. The chapter's Storm Talon gunships and Stormhawk interceptors are maintained and deployed at rates that exceed the chapter average, providing the rapid response air support that compensates for the chapter's lighter ground presence. The aircraft are used not as bombers, not as the blunt instruments of area suppression that some chapters employ, but as precision platforms, delivering fire against identified targets with the accuracy that the Raven Guard's ground forces reconnaissance provides. The Raven Guard pioneered, during the Heresy era, several vehicle variants that reflected their operational needs. The Whisper Cutter was an open-topped airframe designed specifically for silent insertion, an aircraft that could deliver 10 Space Marines into a combat zone without producing the acoustic or thermal signature that standard insertion craft generated. The concept has evolved across the millennia, and the modern chapter maintains variants of the Thunderhawk and Storm Eagle that incorporate stealth modifications, reduced thermal output, acoustic dampening, sensor masking systems that make them harder to detect than their standard pattern counterparts. These modifications are not standard Adeptus Mechanicus approved variants. The Raven Guard's relationship with the Mechanicus includes a degree of latitude in equipment modification that more conservative chapters do not enjoy, partly because the chapter's Forge World, Kiavar, beneath Deliverance, provides the manufacturing capacity to produce custom variants, and partly because the Mechanicus has learned over 10 millennia that the Raven Guard will modify their equipment regardless of whether the modification has been formally approved. The compromise is practical. The chapter submits the modifications for review. The Mechanicus evaluates them, and the evaluation usually produces a grudging acknowledgement that the modifications are consistent with the fundamental design's sacred template in all respects except the ones that the Raven Guard have changed. The relationship works because both sides have decided that it works, and neither side is interested in the theological confrontation that a more rigid approach to equipment modification would produce. The personal weapons the Raven Guard favor tell the same story. Lightning claws for the assault, paired, because the Raven Guard assault doctrine does not permit the luxury of a shield or a defensive weapon. Both hands are weapons, and the assault is conducted on the assumption that the attacker will not need to defend, because the attack will be finished before the defense becomes necessary. Stalker pattern bolters for the warriors who engage at range, the suppressed precision variants that allow the chapter's marksmen to eliminate targets without revealing their positions. Combat blades for the close quarters work that lightning claws are too large for. The knives that the chapter's warriors carry are working tools rather than ceremonial objects, used in the confined spaces and the tunnel environments that the chapter's operations frequently produce. None of this equipment is exotic. The Raven Guard do not use alien technology or forbidden weaponry. Their advantage is not in the tools but in the application. The quality of training and doctrine that makes standard equipment produce results that the equipment's designers did not anticipate. Because the designers did not anticipate warriors who would use the equipment in conditions that standard deployment doctrine does not cover. The Shadow does not need special weapons, it needs warriors who know how to use ordinary weapons in extraordinary ways. The Raven Guard have been providing both for 10,000 years. Among the Raven Guard's most closely guarded secrets is the existence of warriors who carry a fragment of their Primarch's most extraordinary gift. The Mordathan were the Shadow Masters of the Heresy era, Raven Guard warriors who had inherited, to a limited degree, Corax's preternatural ability to slip from perception, not the full expression of the Primarch's shadow walking, which allowed him to vanish entirely from the awareness of beings standing beside him. A lesser version, a dimming, the ability to become harder to notice, harder to track, harder to find when you were looking directly at them, as though the eyes slid away from them involuntarily, redirected by a quality that was not precisely invisibility, but that produced a similar effect. The Mordathan were the Raven Guard's assassins and their most important intelligence operatives, warriors who could approach a target through conditions that would have been impossible for a normal Astartes, moving through enemy-occupied territory not by avoiding detection through physical concealment, but by existing in the gap between what the enemy saw and what the enemy noticed. The Mordathan were there. They were physically present, they were simply not perceived. The ability died with most of its bearers. The Drop Site Massacre killed the majority of the Mordathan along with the majority of the Legion, and the gene seed damage from the Raptor project compromised whatever genetic mechanism had produced the shadow walking trait in subsequent generations. In the modern chapter, the Mordathan no longer exist as a formal designation. But the gift has not entirely vanished. Among the Raven Guard's warriors, occasionally, one will manifest something. Not the full Mordathan capability. Not the ability to vanish from awareness while standing in the open. Something subtler, a quality of presence that is diminished, reduced, that makes the warrior harder to keep track of even when you know where he is. The chapter's librarians have studied this trait across the millennia and have concluded that it is a residual expression of whatever Corax's psychic nature encoded in his gene seed. Weakened by the damage the Raptor project inflicted but not entirely eliminated, these warriors are not identified publicly. They are not given a formal designation or a ceremonial title. They are noted by the chapter's command staff, their capability is assessed, and they are deployed in roles where the residual gift is most useful. The deepest infiltrations, the most critical reconnaissance, the operations where even the Raven Guard's normal concealment standards are insufficient and something more is required. Whether the gift could be restored, whether the gene seed could be cultivated to re-express the Mordathan trait at its full intensity, is a question the chapter's apothecaries have considered across 10 millennia. The answer has consistently been that the attempt would risk further damage to an already unstable gene seed. And the chapter's leadership has consistently judged that the risk outweighs the potential gain. The Raven Guard have been burned by genetic experimentation once. They are not inclined to try again. The Mordathan's legacy persists in the chapter's tactical culture, if not in its biology. The principle that the Mordathan embodied, the warrior who is present but unperceived, A strike that comes from inside the enemy's awareness rather than from outside it remains central to the Raven Guard's approach. Every Raven Guard warrior aspires to something that the Mordathan achieved naturally, the condition of being so effectively concealed that the enemy's failure to detect him is not a failure of the enemy's surveillance, but a feature of the warrior's nature. The shadows remember what they were. And occasionally, in a warrior whose gene seed expresses the Primarch's gift more strongly than the damaged genetic architecture should permit, the shadows produce something that the Mordathan would have recognized. The Raven Guard's gene seed is damaged, and the damage is permanent. The Raptor Project's corruption did not only affect the warriors it produced. The sabotage that the Alpha Legion introduced into the genetic template contaminated the broader gene seed stock, and the contamination has persisted across 10,000 years of subsequent cultivation. The Raven Guard's ability to produce new Space Marines is compromised relative to chapters whose gene seed remains pure, and the compromises manifest in ways that define the chapter's biology as clearly as the doctrine defines its tactics. The most visible effect is the pallor, the melanochromic organ, the implant that regulates skin pigmentation in all Space Marines, malfunctions progressively in Raven Guard warriors. Over the decades of a warrior's service, his skin grows paler, losing color until the flesh is the white of something that has never been exposed to light. The eyes darken correspondingly, the irises deepening to solid black as the same organ's dysfunction affects ocular pigmentation. The hair goes jet black, regardless of its original color. The result is striking. A veteran Raven Guard warrior is visually unmistakable. Pale skin, black eyes, black hair. An appearance that humans instinctively associate with death or with the supernatural, depending on their cultural framework. The gene seed has, over millennia, turned the Raven Guard into something that looks like what it fights as. A creature of shadow, a being that belongs in the dark. A predator whose body has adapted to the same conditions its tactics exploit. Whether this is the gene seed's original expression or a consequence of the Raptor Project's corruption is debated within the chapter's apothecaries. Some argue that the pallor and the eye darkening are natural features of Corax's genetic legacy, that the Primarch himself was pale-skinned and dark-eyed, and that his sons simply inherit these traits. Others argue that the progressive nature of the change, the fact that it deepens over time rather than presenting at implantation, suggests an instability in the gene seed that a clean genetic lineage would not produce. The sable brand is the more concerning manifestation. Some Raven Guard warriors develop a darkening of the skin around the eyes that extends beyond the ordinary gene seed expression. A black mottling that spreads across the face and, in extreme cases, across the body, accompanied by psychological effects that the chapter's chaplains monitor with careful attention. Warriors afflicted by the sable brand experience episodes of intense aggression. A bloodlust that goes past what the combat situation warrants. And in the worst cases, a dissociative state in which the warrior's awareness narrows to the act of killing and nothing else. The sable brand is not the black rage. It does not carry the psychic imprint of a dead Primarch, or the specific experience of reliving another being's death. It is something else, a biological instability that the damaged gene seed produces in some warriors. An expression of whatever the Raptor Project's corruption introduced into the Raven Guard's genetic inheritance. It is managed rather than cured, monitored rather than eliminated, and the warriors who carry it are assessed on a case-by-case basis for their continued suitability for service. The mucranoid and Becher's gland, two of the standard Astartes implants, are non-functional in the Raven Guard's gene seed. The mucranoid, which produces a protective waxy coating over the warrior's skin in response to extreme environmental conditions, does not activate. The Becher's gland, which produces caustic saliva that can be used as a weapon, has atrophied to the point of uselessness. These losses are minor in the context of the Raven Guard's operations, but they contribute to the general picture of a gene seed that is deteriorating slowly across millennia, but perceptibly. The chapter compensates. The Raven Guard's apothecaries have spent 10,000 years managing the gene seed's instabilities, maintaining the quality of the implantation process within acceptable parameters, ensuring that the warriors produced are functional and effective despite the biological inheritance that the Raptor Project's sabotage has burdened them with. The gene seed cannot be repaired. The damage is too deeply embedded in the genetic architecture for any technique currently available to the chapter's medical staff to address. It can be managed. The management is constant, demanding, and imperfect. The Primaris gene seed introduced by Call has provided some relief. The additional organs that the Primaris template introduces have, in some cases, compensated for the deficiencies in the existing gene seed, providing redundancies that the damaged organs cannot. The Raven Guard's integration of Primaris warriors has been influenced by this. The chapter has welcomed the Primaris in part because the Primaris template offers biological stability that the chapter's own gene seed cannot provide, but the core inheritance remains. The pale skin, the dark eyes, the sable brand lurking in some warriors' futures, the biological mark of a gene seed that was damaged in the worst moment of the Legion's history, by an enemy who understood that the best way to destroy the Raven Guard was not to kill them on the battlefield, but to corrupt them at the genetic level. The Alpha Legion's sabotage of the Raptor Project did not end when the infiltrators were purged. It continues in every warrior the chapter produces, in every apothecary's evaluation of whether the gene seed's deterioration has progressed past the last assessment, in every chaplain's monitoring of a warrior whose sable brand has begun to show. The weapon the Alpha Legion planted in the Raven Guard's blood is still working, 10,000 years later. The Raven Guard carry it because they have no choice. Because the alternative to carrying damaged gene seed is carrying no gene seed at all, and a chapter without gene seed is a chapter without warriors, and a chapter without warriors is a chapter that has died. The Raven Guard refused to die. They have been refusing to die since Istvan Fifth, and the refusal has cost them everything except the refusal itself. Caven Shrike defined the Raven Guard for a generation, and his path to the position of Master of Shadows is written in the blood of enemies who did not see him coming. Before he held the title of Master of Shadows, the Raven Guard's designation for their chapter master, a title that tells you everything about what the chapter values in its leaders, Shrike was the captain of the Third Company, and the commander of a formation that became legendary in its own right, a unit of assault marines who operated deep behind enemy lines with a combination of speed, violence, and precision that made them one of the most feared tactical assets in the Adeptus Astartes. Shrike's assault marines did not fight in the standard way. They did not deploy alongside the chapter's battle line and wait for the moment to charge. They deployed independently, inserted into the enemy's rear area days before the main engagement, and operated with complete autonomy against targets that the standard assault doctrine did not reach. Command nodes, communication relays, supply depots, the specific infrastructure that held the enemy's military force together and whose destruction would cause the force to disintegrate before the battle proper began. Shrike personally led these insertions. He was not a commander who directed from a remove. He was a warrior who dropped into the enemy's midst with his lightning claws extended, and who killed his way through whatever was between him and the target. His reputation among the Orc clans of the Targa system was such that the Orcs gave him a name in their own language, a distinction they reserve for enemies who have killed enough of them to earn individual recognition. The Orcs who fought on Targus VIII learned to fear the warrior in black armor who arrived without warning, killed the war boss, and was gone before the boys could respond. The campaign against the Orcs on Targus VIII lasted for years, and during that campaign Shrike refined the operational methods that would define his approach to war across the rest of his career. The planet's terrain, dense forests, broken ground, the kind of environment that favored small unit operations over the massed engagements the Orcs preferred, was ideally suited to the Raven Guard's strengths. Shrike exploited it relentlessly, hitting the Orc forces in a dozen places simultaneously, never allowing the War to build the momentum that the Greenskins needed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. He emerged from Targus VIII as the most decorated combat officer in the chapter, and when Chapter Master Corvus Corax was killed during the Prefecture campaign, slain in a Tau ambush orchestrated by Commander Shadowson, the finest tactical mind the Tau Empire had produced, the succession fell to Shrike through the Raven Guard's traditions. Not election, not appointment from above. The Raven Guard's tradition is closer to emergence. The warrior who has demonstrated the qualities the chapter requires, in conditions that could not have been faked or manufactured, rises to the position because the position recognizes him. Shrike is not Corax. No chapter master can be a Primarch, and the comparison is unfair to both parties. But Shrike carries something of Corax's quality. The combination of personal lethality and strategic patience. The ability to be simultaneously the warrior in the thick of the fighting and the commander who sees the shape of the whole engagement. He is quieter than most chapter masters, more reserved, more inclined to watch and wait before acting. The stillness that precedes his decisions is not indecision. It is the compression of analysis into the specific moment before action, the last few seconds of consideration before the choice is made, and the choice is irrevocable. In the era Indomitus, the age after the Great Rift, Shrike has directed the Raven Guard's response to the galaxy's worsening crisis, with the same combination of concealment and precision that has always defined the chapter. The Raven Guard under his leadership have operated across multiple theaters, often in conditions where communication with the wider Imperium is limited or impossible, deploying kill teams and strike forces into the isolated worlds that the Rift has cut off from Imperial support. This suits Shrike. It suits the chapter. The Raven Guard have always operated best at the margins, in the spaces between the Imperium's major military commitments, in the dark areas of the strategic map where conventional forces cannot reach, and where the kind of small unit precision warfare the chapter excels at is the only option available. The era Indomitus has, in a grim irony, created exactly the conditions that the Raven Guard were built for. A galaxy full of isolated positions, broken communications, enemies who hold the open ground and who must be defeated not by force but by guile. Shrike fights in these conditions the way Corax fought in the tunnels of Lycaeus. Quietly, methodically, with the patience of a predator that does not need to be fast, because it is already in position. The enemies he fights do not see him until it is too late. This has always been the Raven Guard's way. Shrike maintained it, and when he judged that the chapter had navigated the rift's immediate crisis, he did something that few chapter masters have done in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. He stepped down. Recognizing that his mastery of the path of ambush did not make him the complete master of shadows that the trifold path of Corax required, Shrike selected his successor, Athan Shan, former captain of the First Company, and returned to the war in the manner he had always fought best. Not from the command throne, from the dark. The Raven Guard's traditions accommodated this. The chapter does not require its leaders to hold power until death. It requires them to hold power until someone better is identified. Shrike's abdication was not failure. It was the most Raven Guard decision a chapter master could make. The recognition that the mission is served by the right warrior in the right role, not by the accumulation of authority beyond its usefulness. Deliverance orbits Kiavar, and the relationship between the two worlds tells you everything about what the Raven Guard have made of their origins. Kiavar is a forge world now. The tech guilds that once ruled it were dismantled by Corax's revolution and replaced at the Emperor's arrangement by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The planet's industrial capacity, the same capacity that had kept Lycaeus's miners in slavery, now serves the Imperium and, through the Imperium, the Raven Guard. The chapter draws its material from the forges below, and the relationship between the chapter and the world that once enslaved its Primarch's people is managed with the specific pragmatism that the Raven Guard bring to all institutional arrangements. The past is acknowledged. The present is functional. The future requires cooperation. Deliverance itself, the renamed Lycaeus, the freed moon, is the chapter's home. It is an airless world, its surface exposed to the void, habitable only in the structures that the mining operation originally built, and that the chapter has expanded and fortified across 10 millennia. The Raven Spire rises from the moon's surface like a monument to what was done here, a black tower. Originally the administrative headquarters of the Tech Guild's mining operation, now the fortress monastery of the chapter that was born from the prison the building once oversaw. The symbolism is deliberate. The Raven Guard do not hide from their origins. They inhabit them. The building that imprisoned their Primarch's people now houses the warriors who carry their Primarch's gene seed, and the transformation of the prison into the fortress is the transformation of the chapter itself. The slave who became the soldier, the condemned who became the deliverer, the darkness that was used for imprisonment turned into the darkness that is used for liberation. The Raven Spire is functional rather than ornate. The Raven Guard do not decorate their fortress monastery the way some chapters do. The walls are not hung with trophies. The halls are not adorned with the kind of ceremonial grandeur that the Ultramarines or the Blood Angels maintain. The Raven Spire is a working military installation that happens to be built on the bones of a prison, and its aesthetic reflects its purpose: clean, efficient, dark in the literal sense. The Raven Guard maintain lower lighting levels in their fortress monastery than most chapters consider standard. This is not affectation. The gene seed that darkens their eyes also enhances their low-light vision, and the warriors of the Raven Guard are more comfortable in conditions that other chapters would consider inadequately illuminated. Visitors to the Ravenspire, from other chapters or from the Imperium's mortal institutions, consistently describe the experience of walking through corridors that are lit at a level their eyes struggle to penetrate, accompanied by warriors who move through the same corridors with the ease of beings designed for the conditions. The culture that the Ravenspire contains is the culture of Lycaeus, extended across 10,000 years. The values that Corax established, the emphasis on individual initiative, the distrust of rigid hierarchy, the combination of patience and explosive action that defines the chapter's approach to war, are maintained through traditions that are less formal than those of most chapters, but no less binding. The Raven Guard do not celebrate with the warmth of the Space Wolves or the ceremonial intensity of the Ultramarines. Their culture is quieter, more internal, more focused on the transmission of skills and principles through direct mentorship than through institutional ritual. A veteran Raven Guard warrior teaches his successors not through lectures or formal training programs, but through the quality of attention that a craftsman brings to an apprentice, showing how the thing is done, in the conditions where the doing matters, with the expectation that the apprentice will watch and learn, and eventually do it without being shown. There is a specific Raven Guard practice, the Whisper of the Corax, that encapsulates the chapter's approach to the transmission of knowledge. Before a major engagement, the senior warriors speak to the younger ones, not in the form of a speech or an address, in the form of a quiet conversation, warrior to warrior, in which the veteran shares what he knows about the engagement to come, the specific vulnerabilities he has observed, the tactical opportunities he has identified, the things that the briefing did not cover, because the briefing was for the group and this conversation is for the individual. The practice is informal. It is not mandated by the chapter's formal procedures. It is simply what the Raven Guard do, and it has been what they do for so long that the practice has become invisible, part of the air the chapter breathes, so embedded in its culture that the warriors who do it do not think of it as a practice, but simply as how information moves in the Raven Guard. The Raven Guard recruit from Deliverance and from several other worlds in the region, and the recruitment process reflects the chapter's values. The chapter does not seek the most aggressive candidates or the physically largest or the most conspicuously warrior-like. It seeks intelligence, initiative, the capacity to think under pressure, to evaluate situations independently, to make correct decisions without the luxury of consultation. The trials that candidates undergo are not tests of physical endurance, though endurance is required, but tests of judgment. The candidate who survives the trial by doing the right thing at the right moment, even when the right thing is the counterintuitive thing, is the candidate the Raven Guard want. This produces warriors who are, on average, more independently capable than those of chapters that emphasize obedience and conformity. A Raven Guard Space Marine operating alone in enemy territory is expected to function effectively without external direction, and the training he receives is designed to ensure that he can. The warrior thinks for himself. He evaluates. He decides. and the decisions he makes are governed by the principles the chapter has embedded in him, rather than by instructions from a commander who cannot see what the warrior on the ground can see. 10,000 years of this has produced a chapter that is collectively quieter than most, but individually sharper. The Raven Guard do not make noise. They do not announce themselves. They arrive, do what needs to be done, and leave. The galaxy rarely notices them except in retrospect, when the thing they prevented or the target they eliminated reveals itself through the consequences that do not occur. The Raven Guard are comfortable with this. They learned to be comfortable with it in the tunnels of Lycaeus, where the work that mattered was the work nobody saw. There is a comparison that the Raven Guard cannot escape, and that comparison is the most uncomfortable truth in the chapter's 10,000-year history. Corvus Corax and Conrad Kurz are the same thing made different by circumstance. This is not a claim that either Primarch would welcome. Corax, had he been asked, would have rejected the comparison with the specific cold fury that the Raven Lord brought to anything that challenged his understanding of what he was. Kurz, had he been asked, would have laughed, the bitter, hollow laugh of a being who believed he saw the truth that others refused to look at. But the comparison is real, and it illuminates something essential about both of them. Both Primarchs were shaped by darkness. Both were raised among the condemned. Corax among the slaves of Lycaeus, Kurz among the criminals of Nostramo. Both developed in environments of cruelty and exploitation, surrounded by suffering, immersed in the despair that comes from being part of a system designed to consume you. Both emerged from that environment as beings of extraordinary capability, and both used that capability to change what surrounded them. The divergence is in the direction of the change. Corax freed his people. He took the darkness he was born into and he fought against it, using the skills the darkness had taught him: sabotage, subversion, the guerrilla's art, to break the system that had produced the darkness. The prison became deliverance. The slaves became warriors. The skills of the condemned were turned to the liberation of the condemned, and the darkness itself became a tool for bringing light. Kurz terrorized his people. He took the darkness he was born into and he became it, using the skills the darkness had taught him: fear, violence, the tyrant's art, to enforce order through the total domination of the population's will. Nostramo's crimes stopped because the criminals were more afraid of the Night Haunter than they were of anything the criminals could do to them. The darkness did not produce liberation. It produced a different kind of prison, one in which the warden was more terrible than the inmates. Same raw material, same environmental conditions, different choices. The two Primarchs recognized each other. When Corax confronted Kurz during the Carine retribution, when the Night Lord's methods, which included the mass slaughter of civilians as a tool of compliance, came into direct conflict with the Raven Lord's insistence on the protection of civilians, the confrontation was not simply between two officers with different tactical philosophies. It was between two beings who looked at each other and saw what they might have been if the choices had gone differently. Corax saw in Kurz the deliverer who had become the oppressor, the freedom fighter who had discovered that terror was more efficient than liberation, and who had surrendered to the efficiency. The version of himself that would have resulted if the prisoners of Lycaeus had worshipped their liberator rather than joining him, if the revolution had produced a dictator rather than a leader. if the skills of the underworld had been turned to domination rather than resistance. Curzay saw in Corax the hypocrisy of mercy, the pretense that the darkness could be used for noble purposes, that a being shaped by suffering could choose to fight suffering rather than becoming it, that the line between the liberator and the terrorist was anything other than a convenient fiction maintained by the liberator to avoid looking at what he actually was. Curzay believed that the universe was cruel, that cruelty was the natural state, and that the only honest response to cruelty was to be the most effective practitioner of it. Corax's insistence on mercy was, in Curzay's view, weakness dressed as virtue. At Istvan Fee, when Curzay intervened to prevent Corax from killing Lorgar, the confrontation between the two was the moment that crystallized everything the comparison contains. Corax felt fear, not the fear of death, but the fear of recognition. He looked at Kurz and saw the possibility that the difference between them was thinner than he wanted it to be. That the line between the deliverer and the haunter was not a wall but a line. And that lines can be crossed. This fear followed Corax for the rest of his existence. It informed his guilt about the Raptor Project, the horror of having created monsters, of having done something that the Night Haunter might have done, of having crossed the line that separated him from his dark reflection. It informed his departure into the eye of terror, the need to prove, through the hunting of traitors in the realm of darkness, that the darkness he entered was the darkness he fought in rather than the darkness he belonged to. The Raven Guard carry this comparison in their gene seed and in their doctrine. They are warriors of the dark, and the dark they fight from is adjacent to the dark that Curzay represented. The chapter's insistence on precision, on restraint, on the protection of civilians and the limitation of collateral damage, these are not simply tactical preferences. They are moral positions, held deliberately, maintained against the constant pressure of a galaxy that rewards cruelty more consistently than it rewards mercy. Every Raven Guard warrior who fights from the shadows is making the choice that Corax made on Lycaeus, and that Curzay refused to make on Nostromo. Every concealed strike, every protected civilian, every enemy killed cleanly rather than terrorized. These are the chapter asserting, battle by battle, that the darkness does not define what you do in it. Curzay was not wrong about the universe's cruelty. The galaxy is cruel, and the Raven Guard know this better than most, because the galaxy's cruelty has been directed at them specifically and repeatedly across 10,000 years. But being right about the cruelty does not justify becoming it, and the Raven Guard's refusal to become what the cruelty produces is the core of their identity. They fight in the dark. They are not of the dark. The distinction is everything. 10,000 years of war have produced a record that reflects the chapter's nature. Campaigns that are less visible than those of more demonstrative chapters. Victories that are measured in consequences avoided rather than enemies destroyed. Contributions to the Imperium's survival that the Imperium often does not fully recognize. The Raven Guard have fought everywhere. This is not a remarkable claim. Most chapters that have maintained their strength across 10 millennia have fought in every kind of theater and against every kind of enemy. What distinguishes the Raven Guard's campaign record is the character of their contributions. They are the chapter that is called when the situation requires something other than the frontal assault. When the enemy's defenses are too strong or too intelligent to be broken through conventional application of Space Marine force. when the target is buried inside a position that a larger force could not reach without unacceptable cost. The hunt for the Daemon Prince Curnax Voldorius brought the Raven Guard into one of their more celebrated recent campaigns. Voldorius was a Daemon Prince of formidable power who had established himself on a world called Quintus, where he had effectively enslaved the population and fortified his position to a degree that conventional assault would have been staggeringly costly. The Raven Guard, under Shrike's predecessor as 3rd Company Captain, approached the problem the way the Raven Guard approach every problem, through intelligence, infiltration, and the identification of the critical vulnerability. They hunted Voldorius alongside elements of the White Scars, and the combination was effective. The Raven Guard's infiltration capability complemented by the White Scars' mobility, the two chapters operating in concert to dismantle Voldorius's position from the inside while preventing his escape. The Daemon Prince was destroyed, the population was liberated, and the campaign demonstrated the Raven Guard's preferred method of engagement: find the enemy's weakness, exploit it with surgical force, and achieve the objective without the grinding attrition that a conventional siege would have required. Against the Tyranids, the Raven Guard have developed methods that reflect both their strengths and their limitations. The Tyranid swarm does not respond to the psychological elements of the Raven Guard's infiltration doctrine. The hive mind does not experience fear, does not panic at the loss of a command node, does not process the sudden appearance of an enemy in its rear area in the way that a human commander would. Against the Tyranids, the Raven Guard target the synapse creatures, whose psychic connection to the hive mind maintains the swarm's coherence. The biological equivalent of the command nodes the chapter targets in conventional warfare. The precision required for this is considerable. Synapse creatures are distributed through the swarm in a pattern that the hive mind continuously adjusts, and identifying the correct targets requires the kind of reconnaissance that the Raven Guard excel at, but that the Tyranid environment makes extraordinarily dangerous. A warrior infiltrating a Tyranid-infested area is not operating against sentries and patrols. He is operating against an alien sentry network that perceives him through biological mechanisms that have no human analog. The Raven Guard have lost warriors in Tyranid engagements at rates that their infiltration doctrine should prevent, because the Tyranid swarm's ability to detect and respond to concealed threats exceeds what most other enemies can manage. The chapter has adapted, developing specific anti-Tyranid methods that account for the swarm's sensory capability, adjusting the infiltration protocols to address the different detection thresholds that biological sensors create. The adaptation is ongoing, because the Tyranids themselves adapt, and the evolutionary arms race between the Raven Guard's concealment and the Tyranid swarm's detection is one that neither side has definitively won. Against the forces of chaos, the Raven Guard carry a personal weight that goes beyond the standard Astartes' commitment to fighting the ruinous powers. The traitors who destroyed them at Istvan Fee, the Word-Bearers, the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, are all forces that the Raven Guard have encountered repeatedly across the millennia. And each encounter carries the accumulated weight of the chapter's foundational trauma. The Word-Bearers who betrayed them, the Night Lord whose Primarch is the dark mirror of their own, the Alpha Legion who sabotaged their gene seed and turned the attempt to rebuild into the creation of monsters. When the Raven Guard engage these specific traitor forces, the fighting takes on a quality that the chapter's normally dispassionate tactical approach does not usually contain. The institutional memory of what these enemies did, at Istvan V during the Raptor project, across the millennia of the Long War, surfaces in ways that the chapter's culture of restraint cannot entirely suppress. The Raven Guard are professional warriors who fight with precision and discipline. Against the traitors who destroyed their legion, they are something else. Something that carries 10,000 years of debt, and that collects on the debt whenever the opportunity presents itself. The chapter's participation in the defense of the Imperium's eastern reaches, the region of space where Ultramar sits and where the Raven Guard's own territories are located, has been sustained across centuries. The threats in this region are varied. Tyrannid tendrils from the hive fleets that press on the eastern fringe, Tau expansion that tests the borders of Imperial space, Necron tomb activations that emerge without warning from worlds that were believed to be dormant. The Raven Guard address these threats with the dispersal and the precision that their doctrine provides, deploying kill teams and strike forces across a wide area, maintaining the kind of distributed presence that their limited numbers require. They do not hold territory in the way the Ultramarines hold Ultramar. The Raven Guard's presence is felt rather than seen. The enemy commander who finds his supply line mysteriously disrupted. The garrison commander who discovers that the threat she was preparing for has already been eliminated by warriors who were never formally requested, and who left no trace of their presence. The Raven Guard's contribution to regional defense is the invisible kind, and the invisibility is maintained because the chapter's effectiveness depends on the enemy not knowing where the Raven Guard are until the Raven Guard have already done what they came to do. The wars of the late 41st millennium tested the Raven Guard in ways that even the chapter's foundational trauma had not fully prepared them for. The defense of Prefecture against War Skullcrack brought the chapter into one of the more grinding engagements of the period. An Orc invasion of sufficient scale that the standard Raven Guard approach of infiltration and precision elimination was complicated by the sheer mass of the Greenskin assault. Orcs do not respond to the loss of individual leaders the way human forces do. The warboss who falls is replaced by the next biggest Orc in the hierarchy almost immediately, and the war's momentum is not dependent on the survival of any single command figure. Against this, the Raven Guard adapted. They targeted not the warboss himself, though the warboss was eventually killed, but the specific Orc big mechs whose technical expertise sustained the war's logistical capability. Without the big mechs, the Orc vehicles did not run. Without the vehicles, the Orc assault lost the mobility that made it dangerous at the operational level. Without the operational mobility, the War's mass was still lethal but no longer decisive, and the Imperial Guard forces that were holding the line could contain and eventually degrade a force that had lost its capacity to concentrate at the critical point. This approach, targeting the capability rather than the command, reflects the Raven Guard's evolved understanding of how different enemies must be fought. The chapter does not apply the same template to every engagement. The template is adapted to the enemy, and the adaptation is the product of centuries of accumulated experience against every major threat the galaxy produces. The loss of Chapter Master Corvus Corax remains one of the most painful moments in the chapter's recent history. Corax had led the Raven Guard for decades, with the quiet competence that the chapter prizes. Not the most visible chapter master in the Adeptus Astartes, not the most celebrated, but a warrior whose operational record demonstrated the sustained excellence that the Raven Guard's culture is designed to produce. His death in a Tau ambush during the Prefectia campaign, killed by forces under Commander Shadow Soon's direct command, was not the kind of death that produces legends. It was the kind of death that produces absence. The loss of a leader whose presence had been so consistent that the organization built around him had to reorganize itself to accommodate the gap. Shrike's elevation to the Master of Shadows role following Severax's death was the chapter's response to the absence, and the response was characteristic. No political process, no extended deliberation. The warrior who had demonstrated the most complete expression of the chapter's qualities, the combination of personal lethality and tactical patience. The ability to operate independently and command collectively, the Raven Guard quality of being the warrior you did not see until the moment when being seen was the correct tactical choice, was identified and elevated. The Damocles Gulf Crusade brought the Raven Guard into contact with the Tau, in an engagement that demonstrated both the chapter's strengths and the limitations of applying those strengths against an enemy whose technological sophistication exceeded the standard Xenos baseline. The Tau's sensor capabilities are formidable, and the drone networks they deploy create a surveillance blanket that makes the Raven Guard's preferred infiltration approach considerably more difficult than it is against enemies who rely on biological senses and conventional monitoring. The Raven Guard adapted again. They studied the Tau's sensor frequencies and developed countermeasures, not the kind of comprehensive electronic warfare that the Mechanicus might deploy, but the specific targeted suppression of the sensor nodes that the Raven Guard's infiltration routes required. The approach was surgical rather than comprehensive. Rather than blinding the entire Tau sensor network, the Raven Guard identified the portions of the network that covered their approach corridors and neutralized those portions, creating gaps that were narrow enough that the Tau's network repair algorithms did not immediately detect them as gaps. This level of tactical sophistication, the willingness to study an enemy's technology closely enough to understand its failure modes and to exploit those failure modes with precision, is what separates the Raven Guard from forces that are simply good at hiding. The Raven Guard are not hiding. They are operating within the gaps of an enemy's awareness with a technical and tactical proficiency that turns the enemy's own systems into the instrument of their concealment. The wars of the period between the Damocles Gulf and the Great Rift saw the chapter deployed across a wide range of theaters, against the full spectrum of the Imperium's enemies. The record is not as visible as other chapters' records. The Raven Guard's contributions are, as always, measured in the consequences that did not occur rather than in the victories that did. The threat that was eliminated before it became a crisis. The enemy position that was dismantled from the inside before the assault force arrived to claim the empty fortification. The intelligence gathered in conditions that no other force could have penetrated, delivered to commanders who used it without always knowing where it came from. This is the Raven Guard's record, not measured in the bright currency of celebrated victories, measured in the dark currency of things that did not happen, because the Raven Guard made sure they did not. The galaxy does not always notice this currency, but the galaxy spends it every day. The darkness takes a toll. This is not the dramatic toll that some chapters carry, not the Blood Angel's black rage, not the Space Wolf's wolfen curse, not the kind of visible, dramatic affliction that dominates the narrative of the chapter's identity. The Raven Guard's toll is quieter. It is the accumulation of years of operating in conditions of isolation, concealment, and sustained proximity to the things the darkness contains. A Raven Guard warrior spends more time alone than warriors of most other chapters. The doctrine demands it. Reconnaissance operations that last days or weeks, conducted by individual warriors or pairs in conditions that prohibit communication with the chapter. Extended infiltrations behind enemy lines, where the warrior must maintain his concealment and his discipline without the reinforcement of his brother's presence. Operations in which the warrior is the only Astartes in an area of hundreds of kilometers, surrounded by enemies who would kill him instantly if they knew he was there, sustained only by his training and his will. The isolation is not incidental to the Raven Guard's operations. It is structural. The doctrine requires warriors who can function alone, and functioning alone for extended periods is not a natural state for a Space Marine. The Astartes are designed for brotherhood. The gene seed creates bonds between warriors that go beyond the institutional. The training reinforces those bonds through shared experience, and the chapter culture shapes the warrior's identity around membership in a community. To be separated from that community repeatedly and for extended durations pulls against the deep structure of what a Space Marine is. The Raven Guard manage this through the quality of their brotherhood, which is different from other chapters' versions but no less real. A Raven Guard warrior who has spent 3 weeks in concealment behind an Orc defensive line, alone, maintaining his position through discipline that would have broken a warrior with less training. This warrior returns to his brothers and finds a community that understands what he has been through, because every member of the community has been through the same thing. The Brotherhood is not warm in the way the Space Wolves pack bonds are warm. It is the brotherhood of people who have shared an experience that cannot be shared with anyone who has not had it. The companionship of warriors who know what it means to be alone in the dark and to come back from it. The Sable brand adds a dimension to the psychological cost that the isolation alone does not produce. Warriors who develop the brand's aggressive instability must manage not only the external isolation of their operational duties, but the internal isolation of carrying a condition that threatens their judgment. The warrior who feels the brand's influence, the darkening of the skin around his eyes, the rising tide of aggression that the brand produces, must evaluate himself constantly, must ask whether the tactical choices he is making are driven by sound judgment or by the brand's distortion of his emotional state. The chaplains monitor for this. The Raven Guard's chaplains have a role that extends beyond the spiritual into the psychological. They are the chapter's watchers. Not of the enemy but of the warriors themselves. A chaplain who notes that a warrior's Sable brand has progressed, or that a warrior's behavior in recent engagements has shown the kind of aggressive deviation that the brand produces, will intervene with the quiet authority that the Raven Guard's chaplains carry. The intervention is not punitive. It is protective. The warrior is not failing. He is carrying a genetic burden that he did not choose, and the chapter's response to the burden is management rather than censure. There is a tradition in the Raven Guard that the chapter does not formally acknowledge but that the veterans know and practice. When a warrior returns from extended isolation, from a long reconnaissance or a solo infiltration or any of the operations that the chapter's doctrine demands, and that extract the kind of toll that isolation produces, the warrior is not immediately redeployed. He is given time. not rest in the conventional sense. The Raven Guard do not rest in the way other chapters might, but time in the company of his brothers. Time to reconnect with the community that the isolation has separated him from. Time to recalibrate the internal compass that extended darkness can disorient. The veterans call this the return. It is not on any schedule. It is not mandated by the chapter's procedures. It is simply what happens, because the warriors who have carried the toll know that the toll must be acknowledged even when the chapter's culture does not formally acknowledge it. The Raven Guard's culture does not discuss the darkness in formal terms. The chapter does not have ceremonies for the processing of psychological strain. It does not have the Blood Angels' Tower of the Lost or the Black Templars' devotional framework for the management of the warrior's internal experience. What it has is the specific, quiet, unspoken understanding that the warriors know what the darkness costs, because the warriors live in the darkness, and the cost is managed through the bonds between the warriors rather than through the institutions the warriors serve. It works. Not perfectly. Nothing in the Raven Guard works perfectly, because the chapter exists on the margins of what is sustainable, and the margins do not permit perfection. But it works well enough that 10,000 years of operating in conditions that would have produced psychological collapse in warriors less well prepared for them have not produced the kind of institutional crisis that the conditions should have created. The dark is not the Raven Guard's enemy, the dark is their home. And a warrior who is at home in the dark is a warrior who has learned to carry the darkness without being consumed by it. Corax showed them how. By example, by principle, by the warning that Curse's existence provided about what happens when the darkness is not carried but surrendered to. The Raven Guard carry the dark. The dark does not carry them. The Raven Guard have fewer successor chapters than most first founding legions, and the reason is the gene seed. The damage that the Raptor Project inflicted on the genetic stock has limited the Raven Guard's ability to provide the biological material that subsequent foundings require. The gene seed is usable. The Raven Guard produce warriors from it, and those warriors are effective. But the instabilities that the Alpha Legion's sabotage introduced make large-scale cultivation risky. Every founding that draws from the Raven Guard's gene seed accepts a probability of complications that gene seed drawn from a more stable lineage does not carry. Despite this, the successors that do exist have distinguished themselves, and the specific character of the Raven Guard's inheritance is visible in each of them, even when the successor has developed in directions the parent chapter did not anticipate. The Raptors are the most famous, named perhaps uncomfortably for the same Raptor project that produced the horrors Corax was forced to destroy. The Raptors chapter has taken the Raven Guard's tactical philosophy and compressed it into something even more focused. Where the Raven Guard balance stealth with assault, the Raptors have weighted the balance entirely toward the analytical, the silent observation, the patient gathering of intelligence, the willingness to wait indefinitely for the correct moment. They wear olive armor rather than the Raven Guard's black. They maintain a secret homeworld, and their chapter master, Laius Isidon, is described as one of the finest marksmen and one of the least comfortable conversationalists in the entire Adeptus Astartes. The Black Guard, the Revilers, the Hawk Lords, each successor carries the Raven Guard's gene seed, and each has developed the inheritance in its own direction. The Hawk Lords emphasize air superiority and rapid assault from above. The Black Guard maintain a closer alignment with the Raven Guard's original doctrine. The Revilers are even more withdrawn than the parent chapter, their institutional culture producing warriors who are quiet to the point of apparent disengagement. What all the successors share is the pallor. The gene seed's effect on pigmentation is consistent across every chapter that carries Corax's genetics. The paling skin, the darkening eyes, the black hair that every Raven Guard descendant eventually develops. The mark of the gene seed is visible, universal, and unavoidable. A biological signature that identifies the bloodline regardless of the colors the successor has chosen to paint its armor. They also share the Sable brand's potential. The mutation that afflicts some Raven Guard warriors, the black mottling around the eyes, the accompanying aggressive instability, has been reported in successor chapters as well, confirming that the gene seed's damage is part of the inheritance, rather than an artifact of the parent chapter's specific cultivation conditions. The successors manage it as the Raven Guard manage it, through monitoring, through the chaplain's careful attention to their warriors' psychological stability, through the quiet recognition that some of their brothers will develop a condition that the gene seed cannot prevent, and that the chapter cannot cure. The Raven Guard's relationship with their successors is supportive, but distant, in the way that the Raven Guard's relationships with everything are supportive but distant. The chapter does not maintain the kind of warm parental engagement with its successors that the Ultramarines demonstrate toward their primogenitors. The Raven Guard do not hold chapter conclaves or maintain formal networks of cooperation with the chapters that carry their gene seed. They are aware of their successors. They assist when assistance is needed and requested. But the Raven Guard's institutional culture does not produce the kind of outward engagement that a formal successor network requires. And the successors, shaped by the same gene seed and the same general cultural inheritance, do not demand it. The successors are out there, in the dark, doing the work, carrying Corax's genetics and Corax's legacy in whatever form their own development has given it. The Raven Guard know they are there. The knowledge is enough. The Raven Guard are respected by the Imperium's institutions without being celebrated by them. This distinction matters because it defines the chapter's position in the Adeptus Astartes political landscape. The Ultramarines are celebrated, they are the template, the standard, the chapter that the Imperium holds up as the model for what Space Marines should be. The Space Wolves are celebrated differently, with the rugged romanticism that their culture and their sagas inspire. The Blood Angels are celebrated, tragically, beautifully, in the way that the Imperium celebrates its most magnificent sufferers. The Raven Guard are respected, quietly, without the fanfare that celebration requires, by commanders who have worked with them, and who have seen the results without always seeing the work that produced the results, and who file their reports noting that the Raven Guard's contribution was decisive, and do not elaborate, because the Raven Guard have not provided the details that would allow elaboration. This suits the chapter. The Raven Guard are not interested in the Imperium's institutional recognition, for the same reason they are not interested in the enemy's awareness. Recognition draws attention, and attention complicates the work. A chapter that is celebrated is a chapter that is known, and a chapter that is known is a chapter whose methods are anticipated, and a chapter whose methods are anticipated is a chapter whose methods are less effective. The Inquisition's relationship with the Raven Guard is one of careful mutual regard. The Inquisition respects the chapter's capability and occasionally employs it. The Ordo Xenos, in particular, has found the Raven Guard's infiltration and intelligence gathering methods to be of value in operations where the standard military response is insufficient. The chapter cooperates when cooperation serves the mission, and the cooperation is conducted with the reserve that both institutions bring to engagements with each other. The tension, where it exists, is about transparency. The Inquisition wants information, and the Raven Guard's culture does not produce information willingly. The chapter does not conceal intelligence from the Inquisition the way the Dark Angels conceal their secrets. The Raven Guard do not have the kind of institutional secret that active concealment is required to maintain. But the chapter's default mode of operation is to share what is necessary and to keep the rest. And the Inquisition's default mode of operation is to want everything. And the gap between those two defaults creates friction that both institutions manage without resolving. With other chapters, the Raven Guard maintain the functional relationships that combined operations require. They have fought alongside the White Scars, whose mobility complements their infiltration capability, in operations where the combination has proven devastatingly effective. They have fought alongside the Ultramarines, whose doctrinal rigor provides the structural framework around which the Raven Guard's more fluid approach can operate. They have fought alongside the Imperial Fists, whose defensive capability creates the anvil against which the Raven Guard's hammer, arriving unseen from the unexpected direction, can strike. These alliances are operational rather than emotional. The Raven Guard do not form the deep inter-chapter bonds that some chapters maintain. They fight alongside their allies effectively. They depart when the operation concludes, and they maintain the polite distance that their institutional temperament produces. There is one relationship that carries more weight than the chapter's culture would normally permit. The Raven Guard's connection to the Imperial Guard forces that fight alongside them on extended campaigns is, in some cases, deeper than the connection to other Astartes forces. This is because the Raven Guard's operations frequently bring them into close contact with mortal soldiers in ways that other chapters' operations do not. The infiltration that places a Raven Guard warrior behind enemy lines often places him among the human population that the enemy is occupying, and the warrior must operate within that population, alongside those people for extended periods. Corax's legacy, the deliverer's instinct, the Primarch's conviction that the people being fought over mattered as much as the fight itself, manifests in these interactions. The Raven Guard warrior, who has spent weeks concealed among a civilian population, who has seen what the occupation does to ordinary people, who has watched the specific cruelties that alien or heretical forces inflict on the humans they control. This warrior fights the liberation with a personal quality that the standard Astartes condescension toward mortals does not usually produce. He has seen them suffer. He has lived among them in the dark. He cares, in the limited way that a transhuman warrior can care about the ordinary humans he was made to protect. The Raven Guard's culture does not celebrate this caring in the way the Salamanders celebrate their devotion to humanity. It is not a feature that the chapter's self-presentation emphasizes, but it is present, and the commanders who have worked with the Raven Guard in operations involving civilian populations note it. The quality of attention the chapter brings to the non-combatant dimension of the engagement, the restraint in targeting, that reflects an awareness of what the targeting does to the people caught in its radius. This is Corax, 10,000 years dead or departed, and still shaping the warriors who carry his gene seed through the values he embedded in their chapter's culture. The deliverer's instinct, passed down through 10 millennia of institutional inheritance. The awareness that the people in the dark are the reason for the fighting, not an obstacle to it. The Raven Guard protect the people in the dark. They have been protecting them since Lycaeus, and the protection has not diminished with the Primarch's departure. The Great Rift changed the galaxy, and the Raven Guard's response to the change is consistent with everything the chapter has ever been. When the Cicatrix Maledictum tore the Imperium in half, every institution in the Imperium was forced to confront the consequences. Communication disrupted, supply lines severed, worlds isolated, cut off from the Astronomican's light, left to fend for themselves against threats that the pre-Rift Imperium had been managing through the coordinated response infrastructure that the Rift destroyed. The Raven Guard did not panic. Panic is not in the chapter's repertoire, and the conditions the Rift created: isolation, broken communications, the need to operate independently with limited resources against threats that could not be addressed through conventional force, were, in a grimly appropriate way, the conditions the Raven Guard had been training for since the tunnels of Lycaeus. Shrike directed the chapter's response from the Raven Spire, deploying strike forces into the most critical areas, the isolated worlds where Imperial populations were being overwhelmed by chaos incursions, the border regions where Xenos forces were exploiting the Rift's disruption, the strategic choke points whose loss would cascade into larger catastrophes. The deployments were small, because the Raven Guard's deployments are always small, and they were effective, because the chapter's doctrine is designed for exactly these conditions. The Primaris reinforcements arrived during this period, and the Raven Guard integrated them with the same quiet efficiency the chapter brings to everything. The Primaris warriors' physical enhancements were welcomed. The additional size and durability that the Primaris template provides is valuable to any chapter. But the integration required cultural adjustment, because the Raven Guard's doctrine demands qualities that the Primaris training program does not necessarily produce: the capacity for extended concealment, the patience to hold a position for days without acting, the specific relationship to darkness and silence that the Raven Guard's gene seed encourages, and that the chapter's culture demands. The Primaris who joined the Raven Guard were subjected to the same training intensification that every Raven Guard recruit undergoes: the infiltration drills, the concealment protocols, the extended exercises in operating independently behind enemy lines. The chapter did not lower its standards to accommodate the Primaris warriors' different background. It applied the standards and waited for the warriors to meet them. Most did. The gene seed helps. The biological inheritance of Corvus Corax shapes the Primaris warriors as it shapes the firstborn. And the pale skin and dark eyes that develop over time are accompanied by the same enhanced low-light vision and the same instinctive affinity for shadow work that the gene seed has always produced. A Primaris Raven Guard warrior who has served for a decade is, in functional terms, indistinguishable from a firstborn veteran in his approach to the chapter's favored mode of warfare. The Great Rift has, in a sense, validated the Raven Guard's entire philosophy. The galaxy's strategic situation now demands exactly what the Raven Guard have always provided: small forces of exceptional capability, operating with high autonomy in conditions of limited communication, able to address threats that the Imperium's larger military apparatus cannot reach in time. The Raven Guard are not fighting a different war in the era Indomitus. They are fighting the same war they have always fought, in conditions that have made their way of fighting more relevant than it has been since the heresy. The threats have intensified. The isolation is greater. The enemies are more numerous and more capable, but the Raven Guard's response to intensified threats has always been the same: adapt, conceal, strike. The formula does not change because the variables change. The formula is the constant, and the constant has held for 10,000 years. Shrike prosecutes the chapter's campaigns with the awareness that the galaxy's current darkness is deeper than anything the chapter has faced since Istvan Fee. The comparison to the Drop Site Massacre is not lost on the chapter's leadership. The sense of being surrounded, outmatched, fighting in conditions that should be fatal, sustained only by the skills and the will that the darkness itself has produced. The Raven Guard survived Istvan Fee. They survived the Raptor Project. They survived the departure of their Primarch. They survived 10,000 years of war with damaged gene seed and limited numbers, and the constant awareness that their chapter exists on the edge of viability in a galaxy that does not care whether they survive. The era Indomitus is darker than all of these. But the Raven Guard have always been the chapter that fights best in the dark, and the dark that the Rift has produced is, in the end, just another dark. They have fought in worse. The Raven Guard are a question that the Imperium does not often ask, and the question is this: what happens when the warrior who fights for the light lives in the dark? Most Space Marine chapters exist in a relationship with their circumstances that is, at some level, comfortable. The Blood Angels carry a curse, and the curse is terrible. But the beauty they cultivate alongside it provides a counterbalance that makes the burden bearable. The Space Wolves are warriors of fierce joy, and the joy that combat and brotherhood produce sustains them against the galaxy's darkness. The Ultramarines fight in the light of doctrine and order, and the order itself is the reassurance that the universe can be managed. The Raven Guard have no counterbalance. Their existence is not sustained by beauty or joy or the reassurance of order. It is sustained by will, by the specific, deliberate, daily choice to continue fighting for a cause that the darkness they inhabit gives them every reason to abandon. Because the dark is not neutral. The dark that the Raven Guard fight from is the same dark that chaos inhabits. The shadows that conceal a Raven Guard assault are the same shadows that a Night Lord uses to terrorize a civilian population. The skills that make a Raven Guard warrior lethal: infiltration, subversion, the ability to kill without being seen, are the skills that would make a Chaos operative devastating. The distance between what the Raven Guard do and what the Night Lords do is measured not in methodology but in purpose, and purpose is the thing that the darkness most effectively erodes. The Raven Guard know this. They know it because their Primarch knew it, because the fear Corax felt when he looked at Cursey was the fear of recognizing how thin the line between them was. The chapter maintains the line through discipline, through principle, and through the specific awareness that the line must be maintained deliberately, because the conditions in which the chapter operates do not maintain it automatically. A chapter that fights in the light does not need to remind itself that it is fighting for the light. The light is there. The contrast between the warrior and the enemy is visible and obvious. A chapter that fights in the dark must remind itself constantly, because the dark makes everything look the same. And the warrior who stops reminding himself is the warrior who loses the distinction between what he is fighting against and what he is fighting from. The Raven Guard's moral discipline is, in this context, their most important quality. More important than the stealth, more important than the precision, more important than the lightning claws and the jump packs and the infiltration doctrine. A warrior who fights from the dark and fights well and fights without the moral compass that tells him which kills are necessary and which are not. That warrior is a Night Lord. The difference between the Raven Guard and the Night Lords is not capability. It is conscience. Conscience in the Raven Guard is not a natural disposition. It is a trained quality, cultivated and maintained through the chapter's culture the way a blade is maintained through sharpening. The veterans teach the younger warriors not simply how to fight, but why to fight. Why the civilians must be protected, why the collateral must be minimized, why the strike must be clean and the withdrawal must be controlled and the fury must be channeled rather than released. The teaching is not theological, not mystical, not the kind of abstract morality that institutions sometimes use to justify themselves without actually guiding behavior. It is practical. It is the recognition that a warrior who does not control his violence will eventually be controlled by it, and that a chapter that loses the distinction between necessary killing and indiscriminate killing has lost the only thing that justifies its existence. This is the Raven Guard's inheritance from Corax, and it is the most important thing he gave them. More important than the doctrine. More important than the gene seed, more important than the Raven Spire and the history and the traditions. He gave them the understanding that the darkness does not define you. That what you do in the dark when no one is watching, when the temptation to take the easier path is strongest, is the measure of what you actually are. Corax did not always live up to this understanding. The nuclear bombing of Kievar killed thousands. The Raptor Project produced monsters. The Primarch's history is not a history of perfect moral choices, but a history of a being who fought for the principle, while repeatedly discovering the limits of his ability to uphold it. The Raven Guard inherited this too. The imperfection, the awareness that the principle is worth fighting for even when the fighting produces failures that the principle should have prevented. The specific combination of idealism and realism that allows a warrior to pursue the good while acknowledging that the good is not always achievable and that the pursuit itself is what matters. The Imperium does not produce many chapters that think about these things. Most chapters fight because fighting is what they were made to do, and the moral dimension of the fighting is addressed by the institutional theology that the Emperor is served by the destruction of his enemies. The Raven Guard fight with a more specific moral awareness, because the conditions in which they fight require it, and the moral awareness is not a burden they carry reluctantly, but a quality they maintain as carefully as their weapons. In the dark, the only light is the light you carry inside. The Raven Guard carry it, not brightly, not with the visible warmth that would attract attention and compromise the concealment they depend on, but steadily, consistently across 10,000 years of fighting in conditions that give them every reason to let it go out. The light has not gone out. That is the Raven Guard's achievement, in the end. Not the victories, not the kills, not the campaigns won through stealth and precision. The fact that 10,000 years of darkness have not extinguished the light that Corax lit on Lycaeus when he decided that the slaves deserved to be free. Somewhere in the galaxy, a Raven Guard warrior is moving through territory that belongs to the enemy. He is not running. He is not hurrying. He moves with the patient deliberation of something that knows it has time, because the enemy does not know it is there. And the enemy's ignorance is the time the warrior needs. His armor is black, the same black it has been since Corax chose the color that would make his warriors invisible in the conditions they were designed to fight in. His skin is pale. His eyes are dark. He looks like what 10,000 years of fighting from the shadows has produced. A being that the shadows have claimed as their own and that the shadows serve. He is thinking, not simply watching, though the watching is happening. The constant evaluation of the terrain and the enemy's dispositions and the distances and angles that will determine whether the next 30 seconds produce a kill or a compromise. He is thinking about the engagement the way his chapter has trained him to think about it, with the independence of a warrior who must make correct decisions alone, in conditions that do not permit the kind of consultation that other warriors rely on. He will strike when the moment arrives, not before. Not with the impatience that the waiting can produce. Not with the frustration of a warrior who has been in position for hours, and who wants the resolution that the strike will bring, with the precision that the moment requires, at the moment requires, and not 1 second earlier. This is what the Raven Guard are. This is what they have been for 10,000 years, since Corax freed the slaves of Lycaeus and built from the freed a legion that would carry his principles through the worst the galaxy could produce. The warrior in the shadow is the inheritor of everything the Deliverer was, and everything the Deliverer suffered. The revolution and the massacre, the desperate experiment and the guilt, the departure and the transformation, the 10,000-year vigil maintained by sons who have not seen their father's face since he vanished into the eye of terror. The Raven Guard are not a large chapter. They have never been large since Istvan Fee, and the gene seed's damage ensures that they will never be large again. They compensate for their numbers with the only things the galaxy has not been able to take from them: skill, intelligence, and the willingness to fight from positions that other chapters cannot reach and would not choose. They have not been broken. Istvan Fee did not break them. The Raptor Project did not break them. The departure of their Primarch did not break them. The gene seed's deterioration has not broken them. 10,000 years of war in conditions that would have destroyed a less resilient force have not broken them. The Raven Guard persist. In the dark, without the light that other chapters carry, without the curse that gives the Blood Angels their tragic beauty, without the faith that gives the Black Templars their crusading fury, without the framework that gives the Ultramarines their institutional confidence. The Raven Guard fight without any of these things. They fight with what Corax gave them: the conviction that the fight matters, the discipline to fight it well, and the willingness to carry the cost of fighting it in conditions that would make lesser warriors despair. Corax is gone. He went into the Eye of Terror 10,000 years ago, carrying nothing but his weapons and his guilt, hunting the brothers who destroyed his legion. The Raven Guard do not know whether he is alive in any way that the word alive accurately describes. They know that something that was once their Primarch is still in the eye, still hunting, still pursuing the vengeance that the Drop Site Massacre earned. Whether the thing that hunts in the eye is Corax, or the shadow that Corax has become, is a question the chapter does not have the information to answer. They wait. They have waited for 10,000 years, maintaining the Raven Spire, upholding the doctrine, carrying the gene seed that was damaged in the worst hour of the chapter's history, and that has been maintained through 10 millennia of patient, imperfect, determined cultivation. The chapter endures. Somewhere, in the eye of terror, something that used to be a Primarch is still hunting the traitors who destroyed his legion. The Word Bearers know. The Night Lords know. The Alpha Legion who planted the weapon in the gene seed that still wounds the chapter's biology 10,000 years later know that the thing in the eye has not forgotten what they did. Nevermore, Corax said, and meant it. And somewhere in the galaxy's contested darkness, a warrior in black armor is approaching his target. He has been in position for hours. The enemy does not know he is there. The moment is almost right. The lightning claws are extended, and the warrior's dark eyes are fixed on the gap in the enemy's defenses that the reconnaissance identified, and that the warrior has been watching with the patience of a predator that does not need to hurry because the prey does not know it is prey. The strike will come. Clean, fast, decisive, the enemy will fall before it understands what has happened, and then the warrior will be gone. Back into the shadows. Back into the dark that made him and that he has made his own. The shadow that fights for the light. The Raven Guard endure.